What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my third channel, so if you want some more what ifs, go check out my other channels. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. Letter to Naruto from Tyrion. I'm borrowing Bronn and heading off to Pike. I think we both know why. Tell the old man and I'll chop your nose off. Also give me back my wine. That shit was a good vintage. Wishing you luck with your bratty siblings. Naruto, how long had she been down here? Hours, days, weeks. Time got rather odd in a cell more so when you were denied food and water. On a daily basis they'd stopped feeding her after she refused her meals. Her water had been forsaken entirely when she spat in the face of the last guard daring enough to serve her, and so she spent her days wasting away, feeling her life slip further and further out of her grasp. What was the point? What had she left to live for? Joffrey and Tommen were dead. Her boys, her sweet, sweet, sweet baby boys, struck down by those men, by Naruto, by that smug little bastard. She'd kill him slowly. She decided them, all of them. Alas, even the deepest hatred can long sustain someone without at least some sustenance. Her anger gutted so much like her failing body. Cersei Lannister felt herself fade back against the wall, a sob stifled on her lips. No, she couldn't live for her boys. Two of her precious children were gone and nothing could ever bring them back. Though the thought brought bitter tears to her eyes, she must find something, someone else to live for, or resolve to wither away to nothing from within and without. Who then? Jaime. He was likely dead or in prison, same as her. She didn't imagine he'd last long. Myrcella trapped in Dorne with the Martells. They'd tear her apart once the news reached them, and Father, the last man to bring her bread, had laughed at her in scorn when she dared to threaten him. That lion's lost his claws. He'd spat before pissing on her. What had he meant by that? Dark thoughts consumed her as she languished in herself, forgotten by King's Landing, perhaps the world itself. She was barely conscious when the door finally opened. An eternity later, slowly, ponderously, the thick frame creaked open, revealing the light beyond. Cersei cringed away from it with a tiny pained cry, wincing until her eyes adjusted. What she saw there stole her breath dead away, not for lack of trying, mind you. Not only was the exit left unguarded, he was there. Had she the strength, she would have flung herself at him and wrung his scrawny neck as it were. She could only glare. It was Tyrion, of course, that filthy beast who in her sleep-deprived mind had tricked her out of a kingdom, the monster who'd slaughtered her sons, the one who'd turned his coat and let Stannis Baratheon into the city. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course, but Cersei had always hated her little brother, and trapped in the pit of her own self-loathing as she was, she found cause to despise him even more. The fading embers of her temper sparked back to life all at once at the sight of him in his dark silks and immaculate boots, living life while she rotted away in this dungeon, and he had the nerve to bring her food for an agonizing sliver of time. Brother and sister stared at one another agape. Tyrion, startled to find his sister in such a state, found himself at a loss for words. 'Twas a far more powerful emotion that stilled Cersei's tongue. Oh, she found herself quite literally choking on her rage. Words alone didn't suffice. Her entire body shivered with the desire to end his life had she strength to do so. Fortunately she did not, or she would have made the most foolish mistake of lunging at him and losing her life. It was only the sight of the short sword in his belt that stayed her hand. You look hungry, he said awkwardly by way of greeting. The words hit her stomach like a clenched fist, eliciting a faint growl from her belly. She imagined she must look quite the sight, but she refused to let it show. I'd sooner die than eat your poison meal. Are you certain? Her father offered her tray with a wan smile, then deposited it at her feet. When she made no move towards him, I know they haven't been feeding you. Brought on a gleaming tray the foodstuffs appealed to her greatly. A warm loaf of bread, hot stew, a chilled bottle of wine. Damn it, damn him, to all seven of the hells against her firmest wishes. Cersei felt her mouth watering at full, her heart stirring towards the latter. It had been so long since she'd last had wine. In the end hunger betrayed her, and she snatched the food and drink up with grubby hands. Pride abandoned her, and Cersei gorged herself, uncaring for the mess she made as she tore at the bread and ripped into the stew. It was bliss, there could be no other word for it. To finally eat again after going so long without was a blessing. And the wine, seven hells, the wine was glorious. Are you comfortable, sister? He asked once she'd finished eating. Cersei spat in his face and raged beyond measure. The little cretin, trying to assuage his guilt by bribing her with food. How dare he? Tyrion, to his credit, didn't flinch, pausing only to wipe the spittle from his cheek. I deserve that, he admitted. You deserve to die. She flung the bottle of wine at him, only after draining it, of course, forcing the imp to duck lest he be struck. It shattered against the wall with a feeble crash. A finger thrust itself forward at him, angry and pointing. You filthy little beast, this is all your fault. You betrayed your own family. You threw us to the dogs and left us to rot. I did no such thing, Tyrion said stiffly, looking at her as though he thought she were well and truly mad. Nevertheless, I have been named Hand of The king by the prince of said dogs, and I intend to do my duty, then he'll be the first one to die. She raved. The dwarf arched an eyebrow. I hardly think anyone is capable of killing that one, least of all you. What? Taken aback, Cersei leered at him. Why, what do you know? I know better than to piss on a madman's patience. Tyrion shuddered involuntarily. Retaliation for one, Naruto didn't seem the sort to suffer fools, much less Cersei. She wasn't half as clever as she thought herself to be. An assassin had made just such an attempt last evening, only to find his head mounted on a spike, his poison blades ineffective. No doubt a plot by their father, one of many, were another such attempt to be made, and he were suspected of it. Well, he suspected the crown prince would have much more than mere words for him. The last thing he wanted was to be exposed to any sort of political blowback. He knew precious little about the new prince, but what he did know alarmed him. The lad was a credit to his blood and sire. Both cunning, dangerous, persuasive to a fault, and devastatingly vicious. When he wanted to be, Tyrion couldn't put it into words, but there was something wrong about that one, as if he always knew more than he'd let on. More than that, he moved like a wild wraith, could walk up walls, tear through enemy squads as if they were mere boys, and he seemed possessed of a strange magic the dwarf honestly didn't understand. Secretly, he suspected the boy wasn't quite sane, mistaking his silence for an answer. His sister continued her rant. Father will do it, you'll see. And you, Cersei sneered, and enjoy the brief look of pain as it flashed across her sibling's face. Then I'll find that little whore you've been hiding. And enough. Funny how someone could terrifying you so much just by speaking a word or by swinging their fist. Tyrion punched surprisingly hard for someone of his stature. Cersei took the blow full on the face and earned herself a bloodied, broken nose for her trouble, her head knocking against the wall. For a fleeting heartbeat, an awkward silence pervaded the black cells, broken only by the distant sound of her own harsh breathing. Then she clawed at him with her nails, shrieking, infuriated by her brother's audacity, by the look in his eyes, by everyone and everything. I hate you, she shrilled. I wish you were dead. She was used to being in control, to having control, power, to lording her prestige and beauty over everyone and everything. Now she had none of those things, and the thought of it drove her mad. The food and wine only served as a bitter reminder of the life she'd lost, a life she would never live again. No, not like this, not like this. It was all wrong. They should have won. Stannis should have been dashed at the Blackwater and set to ruin that usurper. But no, in her mind she refused to accept that she was as much to blame for the sacking of the city as anyone else. Tyrion, it was all his fault. She lunged at him anew, only to find herself blocked by a wall of armored muscle. Guards swarmed into the empty room like a pack of angry locusts. One of them, the big brute who'd stood, got between, and Tyrion stepped forward, holding her down. Are you all right, Lord? Hand quite. Tyrion surveyed the bloodied scratches on his sleeve with mild annoyance. My thanks, Ulrich the giant chuckled. All the while Tyrion maintained his eerie calm. No one is coming for you, you silly girl. The words emerged as a soft silken purr, vibrating with a menace never before witnessed in her sibling. Pycelle is dead. Your brother, our brother, is in custody and will likely be forced to take the black to avoid the executioner's axe. Gasping, she struggled to turn away from his wrath, but the pressing vice on her face forced her back to him. As for dear father, well, that's one threat that will be handed in short order. And you, he took a step back, his face stoic. You no longer have the strength nor the status to torment me. His expression hardened into stone. And since you no longer wish to see me, well, I suppose you'll stay here until the king calls for you. He lingered and patted her cheek, expression stoic. Goodbye, dear sister. He paused. I'll see you again tomorrow. Cersei froze. Tomorrow? Was this torment going to continue? With that, Ulrich cast her down onto the ground. Her head struck a stone, and she flinched, momentarily stunned. By the time Cersei came to her senses, the door was already creaking shut. Tyrion didn't even look back. He was the first one out of the cell shadow, and all the giant guarding him shot her one last rueful look, his expression dour. Then he swung the postern shut in her face, and with it her portal to freedom. Something snapped. What little strength she possessed had her surging to her feet, but it was already too late. Her hands wrapped around bars beyond, and she shouted out against them. I'll kill you, she shrieked. Once I get out of here. No one answered. Dearest father, I can only assume that the red bitch is somehow still with you. After all, how else would this runner have known where to find me? I'm sending him back with this message and a thrashing. Besides, you of all people should know what she's capable of. Also, a sword you found me, a Valyrian steel sword. I won't ask how you found it, but I'm keeping it. It almost makes up for all those years of bad parenting. I've elected to name it Kushina, after my mother. It fits. I think she'll make a nice set with my twin daggers. Sadly, your blatant bribery won't bring me back to King's Landing just yet, not until I've finished my business. Still not telling you where I am, deniability and all that, and get rid of that witch. Naruto, at long last the storm had finally made its way to the Iron Islands. Wind lashed against the great towers of Pike with enough force to rend the stone itself. Rain swept across in shrieking sheets, while the sea itself threatened to rise up and swallow the cliffs whole. Lightning howled like vengeful spirits through the clouds, ready to tear the very sky itself asunder. Those who did not seek shelter Within Pike's many towers found themselves ripped from rope bridges and cast into the waters below. It was a storm even the most hardened of Ironborn would balk at. A squall of epic legendary proportions. Balon Greyjoy was in right. In the midst of it all now, perhaps more than ever, he felt the years weighing him down like chains on his legs, an anchor doggedly dragging him down into the sea. For his anger mirrored the forces raging at his doorstep, wild and fierce as the very storm itself. Curse them. Curse Stannis Baratheon, and all who allied with him. Curse him and this so-called war. The war had ended nearly before it had even begun. It should have raged for weeks, months, years, even years, in which his Ironborn would reave and rape and ravage the land as they saw fit. In another world, another time, they might have been able to do just that. Instead, the Lannisters had been systematically slaughtered by the unlikely alliance of Baratheon, Stark, and Tyrell, the Defenders, butchered by an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The king killed Cersei and Jaime Lannister, thrown into the dungeons and supposedly left to rot like any pirate to plunder. They'd swooped in to pick over the wreckage like vultures. It hadn't contented them for long. Now that they'd picked clean the corpse of King's Landing, they inevitably turned their gaze elsewhere, to their enemies, to those who the gall to stand against them, to Tywin Lannister, to Walder Frey, to him who knew what that order might be. Balon knew they were coming for him, but somehow he simply couldn't bring himself to feel anything but bitter anger. Aging fingers curled around the tattered parchment in his grasp, fighting the urge to ball it up, hurl it into the fire, and race away to the north. But to do that was to invite disaster and death, and that was something he dare not do. His men respected him for now, but they feared the wrath of the north, and the shadow of the king. The term was a new one coined by the new crown prince himself, and it had stuck once the world learned of his part in the Battle of the Blackwater. The thought worried at him like a dog at a bone, gnawing at his resolve. What could he do to stop such a force? The boy was a shadow, a wraith, a beast wearing human skin. Worse, he was utterly unpredictable. By the drowned god he'd taken to cutting off his men's heads and depositing them at his doorstep. What kind of man did that? No one could prove that he existed, that the prince and the shadow were one and the same. But Balon knew in the deepest, blackest pit of his heart. He knew it didn't matter what his sources said, that the boy was still at court, that this was someone else wreaking havoc. Despite every instinct, this was all his fault, not his. It was all coming apart. Everything was coming apart. He could feel the salt throne slipping away from him with each passing day. Every moment that this menace plagued him, and would continue to plague him until he finally capitulated. The letter, terse as it was, foretold as much. He'd certainly read it enough times to know. Balon Greyjoy, I will be brief. I write this letter to inform you that I have retaken Winterfell, and your thieving traitorous son with it. That's right, Theon is now in my custody. If you wish his safe return, you will order your Ironborn filth out of the north by the next moon. If not, I will wipe them out. Then I will march on the Iron Islands and slaughter you and your kin to a man. I tell you this as a warning. Obey, and you might yet be shown no mercy. Disobey, and you'll wish you'd thrown yourself into the sea when you had the chance. Nor am I the only one who has a vested interest in seeing you flung back into the sea. You know of whom I speak. The North remembers Robb Stark, the Lord of Winterfell and king in the North. This letter had been in possession for nearly 17 days now. His reply had been bitter and cold, for there had been none. But no response came, nothing, none. By anger got the better of him, and he flung the message into the flames of the hearth with a snarl, watched it blacken and curl against the heat. What did it matter that days and weeks had passed and still no reply? He did not fear it, nor the man who wrote it. Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon be damned. The king's shadow stretched far indeed. If he thought he could strike at him here, impudent pups, the lot of them. What did they know of war and death? Nothing. None of them. One did not simply prepare for it. You had to respect it, enjoy it, nay, embrace it. Balon Greyjoy knew what they wanted, and he was determined to deny them the satisfaction they so secretly sought. They wanted Pike, they wanted the Iron Islands. He'd known for some time now, seen it in his own reflection, ever since he'd learned of Stannis Baratheon's great triumph. Allied with the Starks and the Tyrells, he had cast down the Lannisters and claimed the Iron Throne for himself. That the balance of power had been changed was troubling enough. That he'd done it all in less than a fortnight was absolutely alarming. The man had made a fool of him once before, during Robert's reign. He'd been in open rebellion then too. Balon slammed himself down into his chair and resolved to live to fight, if only to spite the country clamoring for his head. As things stood, he doubted his enemies were so inclined to let him live now. Regardless, it no longer mattered. In any case, as the deed was done, he would not go quietly into that seething stormy sea. He would fight and rage, and then, and not a once did he see the shadow. How could he, irked as he was? He certainly didn't see the shadow detach itself from the ceiling, didn't see it crawl across the wall like a human spider, hand over hand, knees aflush against the crumbling stones. Wrapped in his rage, trapped in the foul mire of his wrath as he were, he never noticed the intruder drop soundlessly to the floor, the sound muffled by a peal of convenient thunder. He certainly didn't see the blue eyes gleaming behind the mask never saw the gleaming knives drawn from oiled sheaths, never sensed the vicious intent of their wielder as he crept steadily closer, but he did hear the words "Evening, my lord Salt," and spite the elder Greyjoy leaped from his chair with such force that he nearly tripped over his own 2 feet, and stumbled into the fire he'd soon wish he had. It would have been preferable to what came next. He barely had the time to turn to see the blazing blue eyes of his would-be killer before they buried a dagger hilt in his stomach, driving the breath from his lungs. The opposite end of the blade would have done the job thrice as well. That his attacker had all but refrained from stabbing him outright. Well, the notion actually frightened Balon. It meant they wanted him alive, and he had learned from hard-won experience that death was preferable to capture, all the more so if this man was who he thought he was. No, if this was indeed the King's shadow, as he feared, he would rather go to a watery grave fighting. You impudent flailing! He grasped at the knife in his belt, found only an empty sheath in its place. Against his better judgment he looked up and found a smile there, smug, knowing. No, how had he? When had he? In that brief momentary lapse of attention it was over. A cauldron of scalding hot water splashed down onto his unprotected face, stealing sense with such force that he shrieked loudly, leaving him howling and clawing at his face, struggling to make sense of it all, struggling to defend himself, struggling to see, struggling to fight to his last breath. Less so when the pot itself smote him upside the head. Whomever hit him knew what they were doing, for he felt something crack against the blow as he was driven into the floor, his skull. Undoubtedly he struggled upright, and a boot crashed down into his back with jarring force, giving his whole body an awful wrench and sudden loss of sensation. Balon's next conscious thought, or the nearest emotions resembling such, was of sprawling on the floor, sputtering and coughing, trying not to scream. An angry trail of red streaked itself across the corner of his vision, and to his faint dismay he found he could no longer find the strength to move his legs, his arms perhaps, but his legs. Damn it all! In the end he was forced to lay there, seething, sweating, as a pair of dark boots slowly entered the corner of his vision. He must have been hit harder than he thought, for he thought he recognized the owner of those boots. No, wait, he did. At length his attacker bent both legs and crouched beside him. Then, and only then, did he remove the mask, swathing his face. Dread swallowed Balon like an ocean wave and dragged him to its watery bosom. In a brief, terrified instant of clarity he knew him well enough to fear him. Naruto Baratheon gazed down at him, smiling softly, blue eyes narrow to thin ruby slits. No, wait, now they were red. How could that be? A man's eyes didn't change color like that the longer he looked into those cold red orbs. The more he was certain of it. This whomever it was wasn't human. I didn't hit you too hard, did I? The prince asked, his head bobbing with limpid sincerity. No, don't get up on my account. I paused. I'm sorry, that was in bad taste. He shot a glance to the man's legs with a rueful grimace. I'm absolutely terrible when it comes to holding back. Balon opened his mouth to speak, found that his voice betrayed him. His confusion must have shown, however, for his crippler rose back to his feet and paced away to the fireplace. Had he control of his legs, it would have been the perfect opportunity to strike his back to him. Any able man would have taken the opportunity to plant a knife between his shoulders. As it was, the Lord of Pike could only lay there snarling, wondering how I got here. The boy posited, staring into the flames. Don't worry, I'll tell you. It's a rather interesting story, really a real spine tingler. See, my father wants you dead, but he didn't have time to send anyone. What with the South still in disarray, so here I am of my own accord. One last hurrah, a final drink before the ditch purging, if you will. His slim shoulders rolled in a half-hearted shrug. In short, this little visit is as much for my sake as his. I'm getting all these murdery impulses out of my system now while I can, because Maker knows when I'll be able to let loose like this again. Murdery, his head tilted curiously. Is that even a word? Balon gathered himself up, tried to shout. All that emerged was a dry croak. Guards to me, you idiots! In a flash a hand was over his mouth, strangling him. Don't, or they'll be dead and swimming with the fishes. The prince/shadow hissed into his ear, iron fingers wrapped around his throat, worrying at his jugular like a hungry wolf. Just like most those loyal to you, know, he amended after a moment's thought. Wait, I tell a lie. I didn't kill all of them. That would be stupid. You know, I slaughtered just enough to make them pliable. Shame about your girl, though. I couldn't find her anywhere. I didn't think you had it in you to spirit her away. Which begs the question, was it fear or pride? The Ironborn seized upon the words like a drowning man clutching at flotsam. Yara, he didn't know about Yara, nor where she was. Thank the drowned god he'd sent her off. You know, I'm grateful. Balon groaned out, baffled, when the blonde released him once more by the sea. He was taking forever to kill him. How long must his torment last? The boy nodded, his head bobbing happily. You gave me an excuse to do this. The old man doesn't even know I'm here, though. I'm sure you will once. Varys's little birds tell him. But enough about my father. He twisted the knife, eliciting a pained grunt of his captive. I'd much rather talk about you. Did you really think you would get away with it, pissing off the north and half of the kingdom? I mean, yeah, it was ballsy of you to try, but boy, did you make a mistake. Something broke deep inside of Balon, and he lashed out. By now the prince was close enough for the Ironborn to claw him with his hands. To his disbelief, the blonde let him do so, uncaring for the red streaks carved into his face as he looked on. Gashes stitched themselves shut within seconds, leaving his bemused captor staring back at him smug as you please. The retaliatory blow shattered his nose and drove him back to the floor. Aghast, he cried. Demon! The boy scoffed at him, all traces of humor and pleasantness gone. You may be right, he answered with a dry laugh. Some say my mother was a witch from across the narrow sea. Others think I'm a child of a demon. Personally, I think I might be the reincarnation of some unlucky bastard who died a ways back. Who knows? He shrugged, scrubbing a bit of blood off his whiskered visage. Life hasn't afforded me much in the way of answers. I'm not normal, nor have I ever claimed to be. Now have you any last requests? Balon glowered up at him through the blood, through the pain, furiously defiant. To the end. What is dead may never die, he growled. Kill me, and the Ironborn will rise again, harder and stronger than you can possibly imagine. Naruto scoffed, his voice silken with menace. I plan on it. The boy was a credit to his profession, for Balon never saw the blow that killed him. It was a very good cut. A distant, detached part of him mused. Sharp, precise, and straight to the bone. His head came clean off with not so much as a whisper. Instantly lethal. When it came, he barely noticed it at all, beyond a strange weightless sensation. How odd it seemed to stare up at his body, to watch it tumble to the floor in a crimson heap of flesh and bone. No, his neck never felt the knife, only soft, gentle blackness. Boy, do you take me for a fool? I won't bandy words with you. Varys hinted enough about your reckless exploits for me to guess. I'm pleased that you dealt with the Ironborn as you did. I would have done the same next time. Tell me, before you go gallivanting about the Seven Kingdoms, as to Lady Melisandre, she has provided me wise and counsel, and you will not speak ill of her. As such, I have taken pains to keep her out of sight of those who would wish her harm. Speaking of a harm, I feel it is my duty to inform you that Celis has taken ill poison. The maesters say I know you have no love for her, but there is, I suspect it was meant for me. Come home now, your lord and king and father Stannis Baratheon. Oh, Pops, damn it, how the hell do your runners keep finding me? Then I remember Miss Shadow Pussy, and it makes sense. Oh, and wise counsel, you're burning people again, aren't you? Are you trying to provoke those sparrows? They've been crawling all over the city ever since we took it, and I suspect it's grown worse by now. Do you want another war? No, wait, don't answer that question. And another thing, if I'm going to be tied down to the Tyrells against my will with a woman I've never met, then I'm going to enjoy myself first. I intended to savor it, and so I have. Oh, and good, no offense, but I hope Celis dies slowly, painfully, over a period of days. She's never been kind to Shireen, and I don't give a rat's ass for anyone who beats my baby sister. My recommendation: put your wife out of her misery and find someone better. Father, you owe yourself that much. Hell, even Cersei Lannister would be a step up from that shrew now that the Kraken's out of the net, so to speak. I suppose there's no harm in telling you I am in fact coming home happy. I just need to finish up this letter to Winterfell, and I'll be on my way. See you when I see you. Naruto. Winterfell. That bastard, you absolute bastard. I didn't mean to offend Lord Stark, not you. Ramsay Snow wondered about that. Clearly something about the Raven's message had rubbed the Warden of the North the wrong way, but the bastard knew better than to pry. As if to answer that very thought, Robb Stark, Lord of Winterfell, flung the scroll down near the still smoldering hearth and whirled away from the table with a bitter snarl, an angry scowl tugging at his face. Grey Wind hastened after his master, not without casting a baleful look back at the bastard. He let it pass unchallenged. Powerful beast, that one. Ramsay mused to himself. A dire wolf. Put his hounds to shame any day. He'd do well to watch himself around such a being. Better yet, get one of his own. Now there was a tempting thought, and not an impossible one, at that. Here Ramsay paused in his musings as a parcel was unceremoniously thrust into his hands. Wondering at what it was before he could ask, Robb whisked himself out of the room, in a flurry of cloaked furs that only made his curiosity all the more insatiable. Whatever he'd been given felt fairly light, but first things first. Once he was certain he was alone, he swooped in and deftly plucked the letter from where it lay on the floor, quickly enough to save the message from the heat of the flames. Curious as to what it might hold, he wasn't disappointed. Robb, so you might want to leave the Iron Islands alone for a while, as in forever. See, I may have lost my temper and butchered a bunch of them, Balon included. Figured you should know how many is a bunch. You don't want to know. You're probably scowling right now. In fact, I'd wager my new sword on it you're likely pissed as all hell that I stole retribution out from under you, but trust me, it's better this way. Vengeance can grow in you like an ugly gnarled root, and it'll take hold if you let it take it from someone who knows it. If makes you at all feel better, Marjorie and I will come north with you for your bloody uncle's wedding before I visit the wall. But makers breath, I still think this wedding business is a rotten idea. The phrase aren't happy with you right now, and have always been known for swooping in the past. Trust me, swooping is bad, so make sure you wear armor, would you kindly? Oh, and if you happen to chance upon Ramsay in Winterfell, I've got a neat little surprise for him. It took some work on my part and a good bit of bickering with Roose and the old man, but that deed is done. There should be a writ attached to this letter, naturalizing him as a legitimate Bolton. I remember my debts anywho. I'm off to maim and murder the Ironborn in Moat Cailin before I head home. I'm a fucking prince now. Apparently, I can get away with shit like that. Can you believe it? I still can't. Warmest regards, Naruto. Fascinating. He wouldn't be opposed to seeing his old friend again. Certainly not after all of this. Ramsay. Rob's voice called from below the stairs. Are you coming or not? Yes, Lord Ramsay flung the message into the fire and started, after Rob offering a dutiful deferential smile and an agreement he didn't necessarily feel. He'd always been good at that, smiling, faking it. No one second guessed a kind face and deferential attitude. Theon Greyjoy certainly hadn't. No one ever suspected a bastard either. Perhaps that was how the prince had risen so swiftly through the succession. From what little he remembered of him in their misspent youth, the flame-haired youth had always been a clever sort, an angry boy concealing his true intentions beyond a silver tongue and crafty facade built of kindness and guile. Fate was a strange thing, wasn't it? In another life, another time, another story, they might well have been enemies. Remarkable how swiftly his station had changed. Instead, he'd been there. He had retaken Winterfell from the treacherous Ironborn. He had opened the gates for the Warden of the North and his men, but most imprudent of all, it was he who had learned that Bran and Rickon Stark were still alive. Theon had proved remarkably compliant under the knife when all others thought they were dead, and now he was suddenly the heir to his lord father, destined to inherit the dread fort and all its surrounding lands. Truly an embarrassment of riches. Unlike that Brienne woman, her fortunes had been decidedly reversed with the coming of the new regime. He'd only seen her once from afar, but Robb had told him all he needed to know. Renly's former knight hadn't been pleased to learn of the new leadership in Westeros. Indeed, she'd rode off in a fury several days ago. Supposedly she loathed Stannis for some perceived slight or another. He hadn't bothered to learn which. Regardless, if she planned to strike at the king through Naruto, she was in for a surprise. Now Ramsay considered himself a twisted bastard in his own right, but even he knew better than to poke a sleeping dragon. His temper had been something to fear in their boyhood days, even if he claimed to have mastered it with those purges of his. Sometimes he was convinced Naruto might be half Targaryen for all the fire he spewed when he was well and truly angry. Needless to say, Ramsay had no intention of challenging the status quo, not with that one around, of course not when he was an honored guest of said Starks and Balon's last boy. Though mostly intact, sans a finger or three would no doubt never see the light of day ever again. Pity he'd been well on his way to making a masterpiece of that one. Not that it mattered now. He was certain to be rewarded for his service in reclaiming Winterfell from those hated Ironborn usurpers. The reward might be greater still if he managed to track down the Stark boys and bring them home safe and sound. Theon had vomited that valuable piece of information early in the torture. His best man was on it. After all, Locke would bring them home one way or another. Poor Theon, though. It was a shame he hadn't been able to finish with him. No, wait, it wasn't. What awaited him at the Stark's hand was far worse than missing a few bits. My lord and prince, you have my sincerest thanks for eradicating the Ironborn in Moat Cailin. If you hadn't, I would have had to smuggle myself back into the north. I understand you've requested aid in tracking down Arya Stark. I would be honored to send my son Ramsay to aid your sworn shield Eleanor in this endeavor. I understand the two of you have something of a history. Say the word, and it will be so. Regards, Roose Bolton. Elsewhere on the King's Road. You're a right squirrely little bastard, you know that. Figure that out yourself, did you? Wasn't that hard? So the Sellsword looked up from sharpening his sword just long enough to see his employer place a brace of rabbits over the fire, freshly skinned. Their tender flesh began to crackle and pop, and within moments the men had their supper. Bronn took the opportunity to observe his host. If the prince was at all aware of his attention, he did precious little to show it yet. He still seemed to expect an answer. All the same, nothing about this boy was normal. Most Enbils didn't know how to hunt and couldn't fight, and they sure as seven hells didn't fight small armies alone. He hadn't been privy to the assault on Moat Cailin until it was well underway, until the prince hurled himself through a hail of arrows, ran up the castle wall, ran up it like a bloody spider, and leaped down into the fray. Then came the screams. To this day Bronn still didn't know what had happened in those old walls, only that he'd never heard the like. Whatever he'd done had rocked the entire keep to its foundations, set half the keep on fire, and sent Ironborn running for the hills. Those few that managed to escape him at all, judging by the self-satisfied smile Naruto had been wearing for the last week, it had proved something of a cathartic experience for his liege. Way I see it, you don't strike me as the ruling sword, he said. After a moment's thought, you put on a good show, but it's just not in you. You'd rather do your own thing. True. Naruto barked out a laugh at Bronn's astute statement and surreptitiously rubbed his hands together when he was certain his petulant escort wasn't looking, causing their small campfire to flare. Most men didn't react terribly well to his gifts, but then again most didn't possess them. More and more as of late he'd begun to wonder about that. Where did they come from? Why did he heal so fast? How was it that he could command fire, walk on water, run with all the speed of the wind itself, even the earth itself seemed to yield to him. He certainly hadn't inherited any of it from Stannis, which left his mother, of whom he knew nothing but a name. It was maddening. Speaking of maddening, they still had a long hard ride ahead of them, yet it would have been better to simply abandon the horses altogether and run, in this case to use his unbridled stamina to hasten the journey home on foot, but that would mean leaving Bronn behind, something he had no desire to do, nor was he in any hurry to return for that matter. And why should he be? What did he have back home beyond Shireen Duty, the Red Woman, a broken-hearted woman he'd never met, and marriage? The very thought made him shudder. Something fierce. He'd be tied down, expected to produce heirs, attend grand galas, and make her new. What else? No, he decided he liked this far better, even if it did keep him from his baby sister. Yes, this was what he loved. The wind in his face as he watched the sun dip over the horizon, the sweet music of the night, the open air whipping through his hair. Nothing to tie him down, nothing to hold him but his own will and means. It smelled like freedom, not that perpetual slimy shit sink stench of King's Landing. All the perfume and fragrance in the world couldn't cover the rotting scent of dead bodies, whores plying their trade, and piss poor ale. He hated it, and the thought worried him. He was beginning to realize just how ill-suited he was to becoming a prince. Violent urges and voices aside, he simply wasn't the ruling type. He loved action, playing pranks, and until recently had delighted in betting a certain Shield maiden. Needless to say, the latter was off the table. There was the matter of who would succeed Stannis when he inevitably passed away. He was tempted to simply foist it off on Shireen, but who would accept her? Could he even bring himself to do that, to lay such a burden on her shoulders at all? In the end, he'd have to make a choice. Ho there! Naruto's head snapped up as a sharp voice called to them amidst the waning light, accompanied by the sound of hooves. Their own mounts shied away nervously from where they were tied, dithering against the sudden explosion of noise. Naruto drew a knife, and Bronn was only just reaching for his. By the time they rode up on them, they were soon revealed to be a woman and a horse. The sight gave him pause. Not that it was a girl, mind you, but that she was wearing armor, not something you saw every day. Regardless, he kept to the shadows. One could never be too careful these days. Is there room by your fire? She asked without preamble. Bronn's face lost its smile. Fancy armor you got there? He didn't sheath his sword, expecting a fight of a sort. The woman confessed. Naruto frowned. She looked rather disheveled, but her armor was fine. Fine indeed, to the point of being outright garish, gold and plated bronze. All it had clearly seen better days. So had its owner. She looked vaguely familiar, but no, he couldn't recall having ever seen her before. Maker, she was tall. He felt certain he would have remembered a woman like this, built for battle and armed to the teeth, not some dainty flower like his bride-to-be. Bah, he was overthinking things again, wasn't he? Fine by me, he shrugged, indicating what remained of the rabbits on the spit. Lean pickings though. The woman muttered her thanks, and after hobbling her horse, claimed a spot by the fire pit. Naruto handed her one of the remaining rabbits. Into his surprise, the woman tore into it as though she hadn't eaten in a week. Perhaps she hadn't. Her face did look rather gaunt. Out of pity, if nothing else, he offered her what was left of his own hair. That too was soon devoured, alongside a bit of wine from his own personal flask. As he was in a good mood, he was feeling generous. Besides, she looked like she needed it. It's not often I see two armed men on the King's Road, the armored woman said after another sip. What brings you this far south? Naruto quietly snorted. We have business in King's Landing. What? It was true. So do I. Oh, and what might that be? I owe a man a debt. Her voice was pure steel, and I intend to repay it. Got a name then, Sir Knight? The woman gave Bronn a long languid look. I'm not a knight. Still didn't get the name? Bronn prodded. Brienne. Naruto nearly spat out his dinner. As it were, he turned his head again. Hiding in the shadows, he recognized the name alone, if not the face. Brienne, as in Brienne of Tarth, Renly's once and former knight. It was only a matter of time before she realized who he was now. If they could just away from here before Miss Tight Britches decided to pick a fight, and she would have. That he had no doubt. She struck him as the type to nurse a grudge against Stannis, and what better way of getting back at him than by striking at his son and him? Ergo a fight. Ordinarily he would have leaped at the opportunity, but no, this would be a fight to the death. And strange as it might sound, he had no desire to take her life. Brienne was a good knight, a loyal knight, one of the few honest folk left in Westeros, and he didn't want to kill her unless he absolutely had to. Well, he began standing. It's been a pleasure, but we must be going. Keep the camp. We won't be needing hold. Naruto swore. Keep walking, just keep walking. Wait, I think I know you. She peered closer, the shadows falling from her face. Nope, not at all. Yes, Brienne insisted, moving closer. I do. You're the king's boy. Her face remained blank a moment longer, then it darkened. You mean Naruto? Squawked. Damn, but she was fast. Her sword blazed free from its sheath in a heartbeat, clashing against Naruto's light dagger. Thankfully the Valyrian steel held, enabling him to tuck and roll away from the madwoman. Surprisingly, she did not pursue. Thought that might have been due to Bronn hurling a fistful of burning ashes in her face. Regardless, Brienne of Tarth did not pursue, but instead settled for glowering bloody red daggers at him across the fire. Well, so much for avoiding a fight. Your father Killed Renly. She seated the rightful king. A long awkward pause pushed itself between them. At length Naruto sighed quietly. I know he did, he told me, you don't deny it. Should I? She made as if to lunge at him, but Bronze stepped forward, a cagey look in his eye. The hell do you want? A life for a life, she growled. His father stole someone precious from me. I aimed to take something from him. Sobbed that look. Lady. Naruto scratched at the back of his head with his offhand, never lowering the knife for a moment. I don't. Does that make you happy? I won't pretend to understand his motives or his reasoning, but he's my dad, you know. I can't just turn my back on him, so if you aim to kill him you'll have to go through me. Would you really create chaos in Westeros just so you can avenge? You blasted honor. Her face twitched, but he pressed on, heedless of the danger. Is it really worth all of that strife just so you can fuck? An angry curse was all he had time for as she leaped over the fire and swung. Years of training kicked in all at once, his lightly armored arm snapping up to deflect the blow that would have almost certainly taken his head. From there he lost all thought. Kushin arose with a mournful howl, Valyrian steel flashing in the wan light of the fire to parry the next strike, and then another swinging low to meet Brienne's thigh. The knight blocked with a forearm and kicked out at Bronn, who'd been edging closer, catching him in the gut and driving him back a step. Naruto took the opportunity to launch a vicious crosscut at her chest, denting the armor and catching her blade off balance in what could only be called a jagged riposte, forcing Brienne's arms down and away from her face. Can't we talk about this? He groaned. Brienne's only response was a wordless snarl, and then it ended. Naruto swung high in a sweeping cut, riding the force of the blow home with a snarl and forcing Brienne to hastily raise her blade, lest she lose her head. He didn't stop. Kushina crashed down against Brienne's blade in a flurry of sparks, striking again and again and again, each blow driving her blade closer to the ground. With the fourth he took the opportunity to push himself closer over crossed blades, pushing until her. It was then that Brienne realized he was suddenly using one hand to hold the sword and by definition her to the ground, and the other was arcing back to his belt. Back. Her eyes bulged. Too late. She tried to skitter backwards out of his reach to retreat to some semblance of safety. Too slow. Naruto's free hand and the knife within arrowed out in the next instant. There was no time to think, to react, to even blink. Naruto ended her with a furious, frustrated shout, the small blade punching deep into her skull just below the right eye, driving home into her brain and sprouting up out the back of her forehead like an ugly steel splinter, spattered red with brain matter. Even then Brienne didn't die, and not immediately. Her mouth worked wordlessly in disbelief, fumbling on some last word of defiance. With an angry twist Naruto wrenched the blade free and let her fall. Renly's last night dropped with nary a sigh, her expression frozen in muted horror, a bloody hole in her head. Naruto stood over her rapidly leaking corpse, panting softly. His hands rose, shaking not with fear but anger, and began scrubbing bits of blood from his whiskered visage. Stupid, he swore quietly, gnashing his teeth. Stupid. I was going to let you go. It was a brief and bitter end, and she did not deserve it. Strike the camp and get the horses ready, he said to Bronn after a long moment. We're leaving. It's bloody dark out. I said we're fucking leaving. Lord Selwyn Tarth, it grieves me to inform you that your daughter is dead. She set upon me and my companion on the road, and I was forced to defend myself. Alas, she refused to be taken alive. I understand if you don't want to reply. I look, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Naruto. Several days later in King's Landing, conquering and ruling were not the same thing. In hindsight, Naruto should have realized this crucial fundamental lesson sooner. It was the same folly that had proved the undoing King Robert and several others before him, and it might be his undoing yet. But when your blood was up and you were caught in the heat of the moment, it was easy to forget. When wrath was upon you, when you lost yourself in battle rage, you didn't think about such things. When you were following your Lord Father's orders, completing the mission, there was no time for such thoughts. To think of the future in the heat of battle was tantamount to falling upon your own blade. He'd always strove to live in the present, to not worry about tomorrow and the perils it would bring. He'd always been a bastard. Why should he expect more? For a time he'd been satisfied with his lot in life and had no desire for more, but he had been given more, hadn't he? More than he'd ever dared to dream, more than he could ever hope to possibly imagine. Now, with the Ironborn in disarray, he found himself having to live in a world as foreign to him as the idea of peace itself. After only a day, the idea made him sick to his stomach. No more forays into the dark, no more assassinations for the time being. Now it was only this. Gone were his simple trousers and homespun tunic. In their place he'd been pressed into quite literally a wretched brocade doublet and ghastly puce-colored outer garments, the latter of which only stoked the flames of his temper all the more. He looked like a preening peacock, his only solace being that they at the very least resembled his favorite color. The ghastly pants were viciously tight, and that accompanying cloak bordered on the outlandish. He wouldn't have bothered with the latter if Shireen hadn't gang-pressed him into it. Honestly, he almost missed being no one. Certain things were expected of Naruto Baratheon that weren't of Naruto the bastard, a great many things, some of which he would rather do without. But responsibilities remained as all the same. It was an easy thing to kill a man in a brawl when he was coming at you determined to end you and yours. It was another thing entirely when that someone hadn't lifted a finger against you your entire life. The difference was dangerous, a slippery slope that separated man from beast and kind from cruel. Even he slipped sometimes. But he digressed back to the matter of the Iron Throne. It was difficult enough to capture the throne by itself, even with sufficient force and enough allies beside you. Keeping it was another matter. Truly, when you possess something valuable, the world wants nothing more than to take it away from you. Money, women, even something as basic as a warm hearth. If you could not keep them, they would be stolen away from you as surely as the wind itself. That, however, was a lesson he'd taken to heart long ago. Even a bastard, or former bastard in his case, knew the importance of holding tight what he held dear. Better to keep his friends close and his enemies closer, so that he might know their moves before they knew them themselves. It was the reason he hadn't butchered Baelish yet. He knew he couldn't trust the man, but all the same he required his expertise. Littlefinger was merely one small spoke in the mighty wheel that ran to the kingdoms, and though he longed to break that wheel, he knew he didn't have the kind of power yet. Like it or not, for now, he was back to being a part of the wheel. It was for this reason, if not any other, that he was about to decide whether a man lived or died. No sooner had he returned to King's Landing than he'd been summoned by his father before the Iron Throne. The summons had been rather abrupt. A guard had woken him from his nap, conveying the dire wishes of Stannis with such brusqueness he suspected that the poor sot actually felt sorry for him. He'd expected it to be some minor manner and inconvenience at most to distract him from his drinking. Instead, to his great dismay, a strange scene stood before him, one he didn't recognize, but one he immediately understood that only alarmed him all the more. It was not uncommon for peasant folk to petition the crown for intervention in matters of house and home, though the late Joffrey had all but done away with such a thing. Stannis had revived the practice with a single-minded determination that only a Baratheon could possess, setting aside 3 hours of the day by which to hear petitioners in their pleas. The people loved him for it, if only because he was just and fair, the like they'd never seen or expected to be. And today the son of the Stag found himself dragged into the whole ghastly process all over again. It was made all the worse by the fact that she was there, that blasted red woman, so smug, so confident. Just looking at her made him see red. Naruto narrowly controlled a reflexive burst of breath when he saw Melisandre at his father's side, her pale face inscrutable. Cover my ass, he stifled a burst of fire in his hand. It would be so tempting to give one of the braziers a good hard yank. See how fireproof she was then, huh? Not a bad idea, really. It was a fitting solution, and an ironic one at that. The sooner he got her away from the old man the better, but that was a thought for another time. For now 2 men stood before him, neither known to his eye, looking at him as though their lives depended on it. Was he expected to decide their fates? My lord. Melisandre tilted her head towards him with insufferable smugness. Naruto tactfully ignored her father. He forced the word out between clenched teeth. To what do I owe the pleasure? His suspicions were only confirmed by what happened next. This man, Stannis, began without pause or preamble, leaning forward upon the throne, gloved hand sweeping towards the man in fine redolent silks. Claims that the other stole a great deal of food from him. He is Lord Father, indicated the lesser man with rags and a grim look, has pleaded guilty to the fact and stands accused of theft. I want you to decide his sentence. Naruto balked at this. Why me? The look his father gave him could have been a smile or a sneer. If you're going to rule someday, you need to know such things. He understood his father's words. Then true tests never end. When he turned his gaze back to the reedy peasant and the rather large merchant, the latter all but preened like a peacock. No doubt he assumed the verdict would unabashedly in his favor. Naruto raised a hand for silence before the pudgy man could so much as open his mouth. In this aspect, at least, being a bastard gave him a unique perspective. He knew what it was like to be poor, to have nothing, to scratch and claw as hard as you could for the smallest of scraps to make something of yourself. Yes, he understood this man's plight well indeed, but Maker, why did he have to deal with this? And how do you plead? He asked of the peasant. Please, Lord, mercy. The thin man wrung his hands together and begged for leniency. My family were starving, they were, and Thomas keeps raising his prices. I had no choice. Is this true? Naruto's head snapped back to the merchant in question. Have you raised your prices? Of course not. My prices are perfectly fair. Lying to the crown is a capital offense. The bastard cut in voice silken with anger. I ask you again, have you raised your prices? Thomas's face took on a distinct puce color. Yes, my lord. How many times? 3. How large is your family? Naruto asked of the peasant. 2 sons and a daughter. Lord, the man stuttered out. My wife's got another one on the way. Naruto glanced back at his father. Is this true? Stannis nodded slowly. The city watch confirmed it when they dragged him out of his hovel. Facing the peasant, he inquired, what's your name? Jowen. Lord. Have you any skills to speak of? I am a mason. Lord, like my father before me and his father before him. And you stole from this man because he continued to raise his prices. Thomas stiffened. In the current economy, silence. A word, if I may. Melisandre offered her voice sweet as poison honey. Just like that his temper slipped the leash. You may not. Naruto's voice cracked like a whip, silencing her. This will be my decision. I need no help from meddling priestesses. Castle Black is in need of men. The journey is the destination. Naruto spat back. Look at him. He thrust a finger at Jowen. He's learned his lesson. And how would his family survive? Take this man away, and they'll starve. No, I won't have it. And that's final. Jowen, the man nearly fainted dead away when Naruto turned his gaze back on him. I hereby bequeath to you 100 gold dragons and sentence you to reconstructing the harbor defenses. Your eldest will squire under me once he's of age. Send him to the Red Keep when he's ready. If you are caught stealing again, I'm taking the whole arm. Understood. Jowen balked and fumbled to catch the pouch of coin, baffled by this sudden turn of events. Lord, what are you waiting for? Off with you. Thank you, Lord. Thomas bristled as Jowen skittered away, clutching his coin. My lord, this man is a thief. Surely you cannot. The only thief I see here is you. Brimming with barely suppressed anger, Naruto stormed down the steps to the throne and stabbed a finger in the opulent merchant's rotund gut with such force that the merchant all but stumbled backwards. Lower your prices, man. Eat less. Perhaps then half the city wouldn't be starving, and you would have less fear of theft. The guards ushered the portly man and closed the doors out before he could say otherwise. When Naruto finally deigned to turn away from the now sealed sanctum, he found his sire staring at him. There was no fury or joy there in that gaze, only an eerie, curious calm that left him ill at ease. He'd never been able to read his father, whether it came to combat or anything else. The man might be his father, but his thoughts were often closed to him, an impassable wall of jagged dragon glass that no man could surmount. Many had made the attempt, himself included, and they'd only harmed themselves for their efforts, not him. He'd given up trying to understand the old man long ago. Why did you spare him? He asked at last. He should have lost his fingers for theft. Ah, there it was. Sometimes a softer touch is required, Naruto replied, studying his own hand. What would he do if he lost his fingers? Would they heal like the rest of him often did, or would they be gone, lost to the knife forever? He oft wondered himself. Something in him had taken pity on the poor man, but that man was not his enemy. Others were. Who knows? You'd have me make peace with half the bloody kingdom if you could. Stannis glowered. Our enemies won't fear us if we're so eager to appease them. Naruto bit back a groan. And where would we be if we'd done it your way? I know. Broken and beaten back at Dragonstone. Stannis glared at him with the force of 1,000 suns. Tread carefully, son. He is the Lord of Light's chosen. Melisandre seconded, stout in her belief. He has no need of mercy for non-believers. Naruto gagged. Chosen, my ass. Where was the Lord of Light when we sacked this city? Where was he when good men and women died? Burn them, burn them. That's all you're bloody good for. Apparently, maybe that's why we've got sparrows all over this city. And yet you say burn them. Do you want to burn down King's Landing while you're at it like the Mad King? Because we all know how that turned out. Her silence was telling. I helped take this place, you which I took this city. Naruto reached for his temper, but it was gone, and wrath boiled out of him, red and hot and raw as unforged steel. Not for you or your god, but for my father. He surged forward to snarl at her, and she cringed back, startled by his vehemence. It was strength of arms, alliances, and careful planning. My plan that won the day, not you and your blasted god, not you and your sorcery. Now get the hell out of my sight before I gut you and put your head on a spike. Stannis must have seen the beast threatening to break free, because remarkably he agreed. Leave us, woman. After a reluctant pause, the Melisandre complied. Naruto didn't dare look at her for fear of losing himself completely. He kept his hands screwed tightly shut until the last of her footfalls finally faded. Only when they were alone did his father speak. You hate her, don't you? Of course I hate her. Naruto relented with a sigh. But it doesn't matter. And why not? A pause. Why are you laughing? Oh, that. Naruto snickered, quietly pleased by the question. That's easy. I'm happy. You see, Stannis arched an eyebrow. I don't suppose you're going to tell me why? It's clear to me now that you know this war. It's not finished yet. Oh no, I'm just getting warmed up. He brought his hands together, producing a loud pop of sound. This is war, old man. Total fucking war. Bitter, backstabbing, no holds barred war. Everyone thinks we're content now, but we aren't, are we? Well, you might be. Me, I'm just getting started. There's the Lannisters, them Ironborn. If they start again, the phrase, that Targaryen girl, and don't even get me started on the bloody undead knocking on the North's door and all wall, whatever, that's gonna be hard. But King's Landing, smiling, the blonde spun away, facing a nearby brazier. That's an easy war to win. Hell, I might even enjoy it, but first don't. Stannis warned, his voice stern. Naruto offered an innocent blink. Don't. What? I know what you're thinking. His father rose ponderously from the Iron Throne, glaring down at him. And I forbid it. She's given me wise counsel. Do you? Naruto challenged, standing beside him. Then what am I thinking? Him about the red woman. Stannis countered. You want to kill her? Oh, her, yup, she's a bitch. Lady Melisandre is a bitch. Naruto, she's a bitch. Naruto sang back happily. She's a bitch. She is the bitchiest bitch that every bitched boy. Something snapped. Naruto didn't know what it was, but suddenly, abruptly, he simply stopped caring. He'd won Stannis the throne if he wanted to piss it away by listening to the whispers of a mad priestess. Fine, I won't kill her yet, he reassured his sire with limpid sincerity, but I will eventually. You will not. You won't be able to stop me. Naruto shook his head. For he meant every word, so you have a choice, either you send her away real soon or sometime someplace all hell is going to break loose. Everyone expects me to play their games, to be the good doting prince, the een to your Jan, so on and so forth, and I will for a bit, I'll go to all their insipid little parties, drink their wine, eat their food, I'll even marry Marjorie and give you a damned grandson and keep your kingdom together in the meantime. However, when you least expect it, someone's gonna pull the whole thing down. It felt surreal, threatening his lord and father, but here he was, if not me then someone else. They're gonna bring the whole fucking diseased, corrupt temple down on your head. It's gonna be biblical new word of mine. Naruto interjected harshly, so you have a choice, get rid of that bitch or so help me. He left the rest unfinished, smiling thinly. Without another word he stormed out of the Red Keep. Some hours later, when you were a bastard, legitimate or not, you had a tendency to be a tad paranoid. Naruto had always been leery of company, that is, the company of those whom he wasn't prepared for or expecting. Even in his brightest moments, seldom though they were, he never lowered his guard. Even when he was getting hopelessly sloshed or sound asleep, he didn't drop his defenses. Not truly. Years of growing up in Dragonstone and persistent attempts on his life by his stepmother and other individuals had left him prone to insomnia, which eventually made him such a light sleeper, so much so that he would often start upright at the slightest sense of movement. The tiniest noise would jolt him awake, dagger in hand, a sixth sense of sorts. It was this very sense that kept him awake long into the night. Sleep had proved particularly elusive this evening, and his previous outburst hadn't helped. The room itself had once belonged to Joffrey, nasty little twat, and he hadn't had the time to redecorate it. Thus he found himself glaring at an ugly boar head mounted opposite the bed and imagining it were Melisandre. The little bugger had shot a crossbow bolt right through the beast's eyes, which only gave Naruto new inventive ways of ridding himself of the priestess. Such thoughts proved entertaining for a time, but merely thinking of the infuriating woman only irritated him all the more. He's a blasted fool, parading her around like that. He wanted her gone. She was a poison in his father's era corruption that he couldn't purge no matter how hard he tried. Perhaps Varys was right about her. Poison the bitch and claim it was the work of their enemies, anything that rid the world of her foul presence and incessant obsession with fire. Thus he was in quite the fit of pique, annoyed when the door creaked open, his hand stabbed under the pillow, plucking the knife, ready to throw one more step and you'll regret it, he warned, pitching his voice to carry a small gasp. Answered, your grace. It was enough to give him pause. Who was it? Gradually a lone candle illuminated the darkness, exposing a familiar face. He'd seen her in passing since, and he certainly remembered meeting her for the first time. She'd struck him as a schemer, a manipulator, one who would do whatever it took to further herself and eat great game for the throne. She was part of the reason he'd fled the keep to begin with. He'd been studiously avoiding her ever since he'd returned. That she would go so far as to force a direct confrontation with him was rather alarming, really. Even so, it took him a handful of seconds to find his voice again, and by the time she'd already crossed the threshold to his side. What are you doing here? He hissed. Marjorie Tyrell offered a small smile, her body shifting nervously in the thin green shift she wore. Your guards let me through, she said, as though this explained everything. They are rather strange. Naruto opened his mouth to refute such an answer, then remembered his distrust of the Kingsguard and his desire to be guarded by those loyal to him at all times. Of course Ulrich and the others would let her through. They likely thought it all a good bit of sport, a way for him to get over Eleanor. Odd how a name could evoke such anger and sorrow all at once. Bless those boys, they cared about him, but right now, he wasn't sure whether he wanted to commend them or crack them over the heads. It still doesn't answer my question. He was distinctly aware of her lightning. Still more candles on his desk while he spoke. Why are you here? My those were lovely eyes, and oh, stop, resist. He shook himself slightly and propped himself up on his elbows, refusing to yield to those warm, inviting eyes. I thought we might get to know one another, your grace. Naruto's eyebrows shot straight up to his hairline. Did you now, in the middle of the night, heedless of his blunt reply? Marjorie sat down beside him. They say you killed over a dozen men during the siege, she asked. Is that true? So she aimed to butter him up, did she? She'd be disappointed. 50-something actually, Joffrey included. Damn it, a small laugh burst out of her. That's an impressive number. And you actually hear her voice drop to a conspiratorial whisper. Killed King Joffrey wasn't much of a king. Despite his best efforts, he found himself opening up to this persistent girl, just some little twat shouting about on the battlements. He died easily enough. Perhaps he was tired, perhaps that was it, or maybe he was simply tired of holding everything, and I don't enjoy it, killing unless they deserve it. He stubbornly shook the red haze away from his vision. No, he'd had enough. There was no reason to raise his hand against the girl in his bed, no matter how much she might baffle him. Like Balon Greyjoy, her voice was wrapped with delight. Naruto's head snapped around with such force that he swore he Felt something crack in his neck. Maker, does everyone know about that now? More laughter followed like musical bells. You're not a cruel man, are you? The question flummoxed him. Was he cruel? He'd done things he wasn't proud of. Certainly killing Brienne was one of the most recent of those instincts. She'd pressed him, and the beast had come howling out, driving a dagger into her skull. He'd let that lad Tommen be gutted by his order, and there were countless other mistakes before that he'd killed in anger. Fits of pique, some of them had been for a good cause, others Maker above. He'd done things that would make Ramsay Snow soil his sheets, but did that make him cruel? Did he take pleasure in it, or was he so broken that he simply didn't know how? He honestly didn't know anymore. I do what is necessary, he said at last. What others refused to do that seemed to satisfy Marjorie, at least for the moment. Then she gave him the look. It was a look he knew all too well, but on her it was downright dangerous. And what do you think is necessary now? Her breath ghosted along the back of his neck, causing him to stiffen in more ways than one. For a mere moment he was tempted. What was the harm? He was meant to marry her the next morning. Daenerys Stormborn certainly lived up to her namesake. She arrived during one of the worst storms King's Landing had ever seen, in a ship that seemed ready to capsize at any moment. Not a prisoner, but not a conqueror either. She radiated defiance and beauty with every step, bright eyes dancing like the storm in which they found themselves. Her hair the palest silver. A great bear of a man stood with her, looking as though he were trying to shield her from the very storm itself. You're a Mormont, no doubt, and there are ways behind them in cages, likely squeaking and chittering their indignant protest dragons. The thought sent a small hum of anticipation coursing through Naruto. He'd always wanted to meet a dragon, but not like this. This complicated things. Everything part of him was still trying to decide whether or not this was all a dream. It certainly seemed like one. He hadn't understood why Littlefinger would drag him out of bed now, curiously empty and smelling of roses, for this, until he'd seen the ship from afar, and even then he still hadn't believed it until she stepped off the galley. Of course the next sentiment he felt was rage from their perch at the end of the dock. He could afford to show a little emotion, soaked as he was. You absolute bastard, he growled, watching the guards move to flank the last daughter of the Mad King. Surely such an escort wasn't needed. What could the girl do? Still, the very notion that she was here threatened to undo everything he'd worked for, all he'd done to place Stannis on the Iron Throne. What would he do once he learned of this? Would he call it treason? Would he try to have him killed? One could only wonder, and it's the wondering that killed him. As if sensing those very thoughts, Littlefinger smiled thinly beside him. Do you believe me now, my lord, he asked, and for the life of him Naruto couldn't rightly tell if the man was being sarcastic or not. You asked for a dragon, I brought you them and their mother. Alas, the Iron Bank of Bravos was not so generous. I was being sarcastic, Naruto growled quietly as the last Targaryen drew near. I thought you knew the difference. Baelish offered a laugh. Perhaps next time you should be more specific then. Oh, I'll give you specific, you little. The storm stole his words away, and then there was no more time, for the Targaryen contingent was upon them up close. The poor girl looked like a drowned rat, not at all threatening considering she possessed only a handful retainers and a single armed guard. Pity, from what he'd heard, he'd expected her to cross the narrow sea with a horde of Dothraki screamers at her back. Wherever she'd been, she looked none too pleased that she'd been plucked from the other side of the world and dragged to Westeros with no army at her back. At that, thank you for accepting our invitation, my lady. Baelish bowed low as the pair drew near. You honor us with your presence. The last Targaryen scowled, bright eyes ablaze. Why have you brought me here? Naruto sighed. Well, you see, someone doesn't understand sarcasm. Bright eyes cut to him, glowering with cold fire. And you are a bitter laugh escaped the son of the Stag. I suppose we'll find out, won't we? Time skip. Letter to Naruto from Ramsay. Naruto, I understand we have a Targaryen in the capital. I won't ask how or why, only that you have terrible timing. As to the rest, you have my thanks. If we're being perfectly honest here, I didn't expect you to honor your promise, but you did, and from one bastard to another you have my eternal gratitude. Just wanted to say that I'm not good with gratitude. Changing subjects, Eleanor arrived safe and sound to aid us with the hunt for Rob's sister. What a woman. I don't know why you let her slip away, but I suppose you're not one to speak of such things, are you? Don't worry, I'll treat her with respects and dignities. All it's the least I can do. On another note, we've picked up the Stark girl's trail. I swear your woman's half dog the way she can't say anymore. Your wife's glaring at me. Kidding, I'm kidding. Good luck, Ramsay. Sometime later. Naruto's response, Ramsay, long time no Raven. Sorry, had to say it. So you're with Eleanor now? Not like that, I hope. Have you two tracked down Arya yet? Rumor has it she's been seen with the Hound, and not like that. UASS Maker, I know how your mind works as to the matter we discussed earlier. Yes, she's here and I have no idea what to do with her. She tried to have me roasted, but apparently I'm still fireproof thanks to that incident. When we're kids, need ha-oh and take care of my shield maiden, or I'll tie you up and feed you to your hounds. Knee deep in shit once again. Naruto, to say that Stannis was angry would have been an understatement. He was livid. Anyone else would have been thrown into the dungeons and left to rot It took a combined alliance of Naruto, Varys, Littlefinger, and surprisingly Melisandre of all people to keep him from calling for her outright execution. The Tyrells remained silent on the matter, but Naruto knew enough of politics to know that the pall would not last long. As soon as the Queen of Thorns learned of this, there would be trouble. He wasn't looking forward to that. The Starks likely wouldn't care one way or another's. After all he'd done to bring Sansa home and make peace in the north, but Stannis, in the end, it was only their insistence that Dany did not in fact have an army at her back that prevented his lord father from doing anything rash. It did not, however, spare Naruto the complete and utter shame of being caught with guard down for the first time in a decade. He was forced to listen red-faced, as his father ruthlessly berated him for his insolence. It didn't matter that Littlefinger had been the one to orchestrate it. He'd given the word more or less unintentionally, and that made him just as suspect. Anyone else would have been executed on the spot. Littlefinger managed to escape the ordeal with both body and pride intact, claiming he was merely serving the will of the crown, that and the promise that any attempt or showing of disloyalty in the future would result in a lifetime in the black cells. Naruto, well, he wasn't so fortunate in the end. He was given an impossible choice: either toss the last dragon and her followers into the sea and let them drown, or accept punishment in her stead. He was even given another choice. In the latter, he could allow himself to be flogged 50 times, give up a hand, or gouge out his right eye. The answer to Stannis was obvious: throw Daenerys Targaryen and her pets into the Blackwater, let her perish there, and the threat she and her dragons presented die with her. It made sense. His son owed this Targaryen girl nothing, and if he was truly innocent in whatever myriad plot he claimed Littlefinger devised, he would have no problem in seeing her perish. It was the way of things. Naruto as ever shocked them all. 50 lashes later: you called for me, my lord. A long drawn-out pause answered: is Marjorie with you? She is not, my lord. Good, I don't want her to see me lick Aargh. An angry growl warped those words into a yowl, a fierce bestial snarl that had no business issuing forth from a man's throat. It swallowed the muted sound of Qyburn's whole and nigh, but threatened to come crashing through the door and drag the former maester inside if he did not open it this very instant. He immediately regretted knocking to begin with. Clearly his benefactor was in no mood to bandy words or other pleasantries, and why should he be? He'd taken 50 strikes from the whip for a crime he didn't commit, all for some girl he barely knew. Your grace, are you pluffin' deaf, man? Get in here. Qyburn was gone from the hall faster than a copper and flea bottom. Upon entering, he barely had time to so much as glimpse his patient before he found himself face to face with a wall of impenetrable steel. No fewer than a dozen men and more than a few women stood guard over a prone figure on the bed, distinguishable only by their varying states of armor and weaponry. Each looked ready to skewer if he stepped so much as a single centimeter out of line. It appeared a few of Tyrion's wilder folk had taken a liking to the equally wild Baratheon, and towering over the rest, a man who could easily rival the mountain himself, Ulrich, stood watch over his host. That same burly brute immediately moved to bar Qyburn's path when he brought out his tools. Not another step, old man. The words emerged as a growl. He's suffered enough. Ulrich, a weak voice groaned from the bed. Move your bloody ass. He's not going to hurt me. If he does, I'll kill him myself. Sound fair? The giant grunted, but stepped aside. All the same, Qyburn felt the berserker's eyes on him. With each step he took, almost as though the Lowlander were waiting for an excuse. By the time he reached Naruto's bedside and pulled the sheet away, they were trying to bore an angry red hole in his back. Fortunately, all thoughts of payback fled out his mind like a thief from a window once he got a good look at the wounds. That bad? And Naruto whispered, his voice hoarse. For an alarming moment Qyburn found he couldn't answer for the sight that awaited him there had all but stolen his breath away. He'd seen and done many an unethical thing in the hallowed pursuit of knowledge and advancement, countless experiments, several of which had gotten him banned from the Citadel. He was no stranger to pain or blood after all, but this Naruto's wounds exceeded all those several times over. Stannis had laid into his heir apparent with fire and fury enough to be deemed spiteful enough to make his point clear. The king's price for what he deemed insolence was high indeed. Dozens of bloody red furrows on Naruto's flesh stood in stark testament to that. Crimson canyons crosscut across the length of his hips, back, and in some areas even his upper shoulders. Some of them had cut clear to the bone in places. 50 lashes in all, administered in the privacy of the prince's personal chambers. Judging by the bloodstains on the walls and floors, that was the lone mercy Stannis had allowed the young man, so as not to shame him before the whole of King's Landing. That the prince had allowed it at all was something of a miracle. Here was an exceptionally dangerous young man, easily capable of decimating small armies when the needs suited him. He did not bow, he did not scrape, he lived as he pleased without ca. Yet from what he'd endured the punishment all the same without so much as a whimper. Qyburn, his host, continued after a moment, still not looking at him. Am I an idiot? And there it was, the loaded question. Your grace, I don't believe. Don't bullshit me. Sapphire orbs cut across at him like azure dagger, sharp and jagged. I want a straight answer, and right now only you can provide that much as I hate to admit it. My men are too loyal to tell me if I've fucked up, and Shireen's too nice. Everyone else is just plain scared shitless. So he blinked. Am I an idiot? Am I fucking retarded for killing like a mad dog, for letting the last Targaryen into the city, for letting my own father whip me as if I were no one, nothing for her sake? Tell it to me straight. Qyburn paused at that, weighing his options. Naruto valued honesty above all. He'd seen it time and time again in his brief tenure as the boy's maester. Naruto provided him unrestricted access to the Red Keep and all of its resources, not to mention materials for his experiments, and a fair deal that the Citadel considered unethical. Doubtlessly the prince thought so as well in his heart of hearts, but he saw the practical applications of such ventures. Qyburn had risen high indeed, because of him far higher than he would have done so anywhere else. Lying would only jeopardize that position. If I might be so bold, my lord, he ventured, why go to such lengths? You owe Daenerys nothing. Her very presence here threatens to unhinge everything for you. I fucking know. Naruto groaned, flopping back onto the bed only to hiss in immediate pain as his entire back violently protested the affront to his wounds. But once I saw her, I couldn't send her away. She's nowhere to go. She has nothing, is nothing. Those blue eyes took on an angry, melancholy look. I know what that feels like, to be a nobody in your own home, to be sneered at like some damn mutt kicked when you're down. This place was her home once, even if she doesn't remember it. She reminds you of yourself. Qyburn said. The blonde blinked. Fuck, he swore, laughing. I guess she does in a way. Maybe I can talk her down, find her a room or something. You are Qyburn swallowed, aware that she still has her dragons. They're tiny. Naruto scoffed. For now, ugh, fine, she'll stay here under guard. Are you sure? That's entirely wise. Naruto's silence was telling. My lord, Qyburn ventured, choosing each word with the utmost care. Reflection is all well and good, but I need to tend to your wounds before they fester. What? No, came the grunt. No stitches, don't need them. Qyburn balked at this. Pardon, no stitches, the prince rumbled, pressing his head into a pillow, or I'll knock your teeth out. I'm afraid I must insist. A strong hand wrapped around the collar of his robe and yanked him down to meet the prince's gaze. Eyes the color of bloody red rubies blazed out at him, angry and slitted like that of a cat's. A rational man might have withered beneath such a gaze. Coward fear, but Qyburn, he found himself far too fascinated by the sight before him. Incredible. What sort of phenomena had he gone through to gain eyes like those? Did they change according to his state of mood? Did strong emotions force the change? So many questions, not enough answers. Perhaps he wouldn't mind submitting a sample of his blood, as if sensing that very thought. Naruto gave him a bleak smile. No, odd how a single word could convey such menace. In the end he found himself nodding dutifully and was released. As you wish. No stitches, but I don't understand why summon me if not for I'll be fine in a bit. His patron ground out through gritted teeth. I just need something for the pain, can't heal that. I do have some milk of the poppy maker. Yes, it was out of his hands in an instant. Give it here when you said he'll have a look. Should be kicking in about now. Reluctantly Qyburn did just that. Indeed his back was red and bloody, but now that he looked again, the young man's wounds didn't seem quite so grievous as they had before. Somehow impossible. He'd seen bone only a few moments ago. Now he saw only torn muscle and angry red welts. That shouldn't be possible. Wounds like this could cripple or paralyze a man more than twice the prince's size. Never mind the fact that Naruto had all but been flayed within inches of his life. No amount of herbs or poultices could possibly hope to undo this much damage in such a short amount of time. Yet the longer he looked, the more certain he became. This happens often, constantly. Naruto answered, already stifling an oncoming yawn. I've always been like this. Get my ass kicked, heal up, get stronger, rinse and repeat. It's actually pretty damn useful. The old man knows all about it, probably why he let me choose. Qyburn frowned thoughtfully. You mean? Naruto laughed. Why else would I stand there and take it? Remind me to tell you about that time I lost most of my hand during sword practice. Hurt like hell, took weeks to grow back. This awry glance over his shoulder followed by a flash of teeth. I'll be up and walking in a couple of days. Doesn't stop it from hurting though. In my case, any healing comes with a price, and I think he knows that if he tries to hurt me again he'll regret it. Fascinating. Does she know about this? Naruto crowed quietly. I suppose she will soon enough. Wonder what she'll have to say. Engrossed as he was, Qyburn was wholly unprepared. When the door opened, slammed really open for a second time, the guards weren't all at once. The room exploded into motion. Someone tossed him off the bed and his head struck a desk. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of drawn steel. By then the intruder was already well through the door with no time to retreat, let alone react fast. Ulrich was faster still. The burly brute moved with a speed that betrayed his size, slamming into the trespasser like a rampaging bull. A large hand locked around their throat lifted them off the floor and slammed them down against the wall, all one and the same. It was only then that they heard the hiss, then all bloody hell broke loose. Dracarys, Naruto squawked a moment later. Drop her. Ulrich did as he was bade, furiously patting his sleeve to extinguish the fire. There Daenerys Targaryen slumped against the wall, Drogon bristling furiously against her shoulder. Indignant anger seemed to hang around her like a fell cloud, ready to lash out at the next person to so much as glance at her or even in her direction. Sorry about that, Naruto croaked. My men are a bit twitchy today. The last dragon paused, looked as though she were about to snap at him, and finally saw the bloodstains on the floor. Then she saw Naruto's wounds, and an involuntary gasp leaped from her lips. For a moment, a mere millisecond, the most fleeting of instants, she looked very young, Qyburn thought. Then her eyes hardened into violet amethysts, and the child within was once more buried beneath layers of hard, unflinching scale. Have you gone mad? She demanded really, as she climbed to her feet, words spilling out of her in a furious hiss. Why did you do that? I didn't need you to come to my aid. A spark of hot ire and annoyance blazed across the blonde's face, quickly quelled moments later. What can I say? He sighed quietly. I'm a sucker for damsels and impoverished types. Her lips formed a thin line. Then you are even more of a fool than I thought. Ulrich struck her across the face. You will address your prince with respect, Ulrich. Naruto's voice cracked like the very whip that had wounded him, and the giant flinched. Apologize now. Ulrich reluctantly relented and lowered his head. Sorry, my lady, Drogon hissed, and Daenerys shot the giant a glower, but otherwise remained mute on the matter. Instead, she drew herself up and turned a seething glare upon Naruto himself. It was a very impressive glare, the blonde thought to himself, full of fire and fury, even addled by the poppy as he was. She actually unnerved him just a bit. Here was someone who'd grown accustomed to having their life turned upside down at the drop of a hat, yet in spite of that, Daenerys Stormborn possessed an iron will to make kings tremble, an unbending force that threatened to take the world and shape it anew. I demand an explanation. Then she opened her mouth, and Naruto simply couldn't help himself any longer, doped as he laughed in her face. Do you now? Well, I demand that you sit your pretty little ass down and stop acting like you're a queen, cause in case you haven't noticed, you're not Khaleesi right now. You're a queen of nothing. You have no people, no army, only a handful of loyal advisors and your dragons. She looked all of a moment from flying off the handle at him, but still he pressed on. But you asked me a question, so tell you what I'll answer. Some men like to fight, others like to fuck me. I like to fish. What? Wasn't even fishing for a dragon to begin with, really. Naruto drawled onward, admiring a bit of imaginary dust beneath his fingers. Didn't want one, yet here you are. I can't kill you because that'd be wrong. I can't send you back across the sea because yeah, that'd also be a complete dick move on my part and would just as likely lead to a long, painful death of starvation. With utmost care he spread his arms and sat up, slowly wincing against the tender pain of tendons knitting themselves back together in his back. So here we are, he said at last. You hate me for what I am, and I honestly don't know what to think of you. Hell, I don't even know who you are. Are you an ally or an enemy? Who are you? Daenerys. She seemed to consider that for a moment. Daenerys did. Qyburn watched her eyes harden. I am the queen of the Undulls, she started quietly but with growing strength, her voice blazing like the very flames from which she'd emerged so long ago. The Rhoynar and the first men, Lady Regnant of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, and the mother of dragons. And who are you? Naruto whistled softly from where he sat. Fierce. I like that. With an effort he stood. Drogon flared his wings and screeched a warning. Such a thing was tantamount to a mice squeaking at a stag. For Naruto did not fear it. He doesn't like me, does he? Daenerys bristled. Neither do I. Such lies. I could go on. Naruto waved a hand, cutting her off in mid-sentence, but I'd rather spare you the endless titles and platitudes. Now that you're here, you are under my protection for better or worse. His words belied the quiet anger burning in his gaze. And I'd thank you not to insult those who would do you no harm. A hand rose, trembling only slightly from the pain as its owner indicated the men standing within. And without these men here are loyal to me and me alone. Their loyalty cannot be bought with coin or threats, so you need fear nothing from them. You will not be harmed. You will not be harassed. No one is to touch you, not even my father. Anyone who tries will lose the hand. I'm no Khal Drogo, but I'll still swear it on my life. A flash of hurt flickered in those wide eyes, reminding Qyburn of an old wound not yet healed. You say much. Such a fire. Qyburn wondered what it would take to cool such a flame, for if Daenerys was fire, then Naruto was almost certainly wind, destined to fan those flames. He was rather curious to see how it would turn out, but Daenerys said something else, something that sparked the Prickney's temper for the final time. I'm starting to think you're insane, she was saying to him when he finally came back to himself. I'm also known for walking on fucking water. It is known. Naruto launched into her with an old Dothraki saying, causing the last Targaryen to start abruptly. Surprised. I'm a learned man myself. I know nearly every language out there, believe it or not, your highness. I also know what it's like to start from nothing. You would do well to remember it, that and I'm not your enemy. Balk all you like, but it's the truth that whatever it was seemed to do the trick. Speechless, she stood there for a long moment, fuming. Drogon's neck pivoted this way and that, angry and baffled. Then Daenerys gathered him up and stormed out in a swirl of silk and skirts. A gesture from Naruto had 3 guards at her heels, each determined to direct the angry princess to her chamber. Qyburn sighed into the silence that followed. That went well. Naruto laughed bitterly and staggered back To the bet I've shocked her into thinking for once. He coughed. Do me a favor and send a raven to Winterfell. Ask Eleanor for an update. Should I inform her of the incident with your father? What? Naruto blinked, his resistance to the medicine crumbling at last. Yeah, whatever, don't fucking care. And what will you do, my lord? I'm taking a fucking nap. That was all he got out before sleep finally took him. Naruto, I've received your maester's raven. I'm certain I'm the last person you want to talk to right now. For I've hurt you dearly, but I feel this must be said. You did what Stannis did. What no father should so abuse their son, let alone whip him to a pulp. How could you let him do such a thing? Have you taken leave of your senses? Never mind, don't answer that. I know you. You'd have had a reason for it. You're not the sort to act without a plan. You never were. So if you've taken the last Targaryen under your wing, I feel you must have a reason. Even if I can't bring myself to understand it, you always did have a penchant for taking on lost causes. I've also heard things, hence you've certainly wasted no time in moving on. No, I shouldn't have said that. Damn it, I didn't mean it. I was the one who left you. My mistake. I wasn't strong enough to understand you. I have no right to be jealous. I shouldn't be jealous. Lady Marjorie is a beautiful woman and you deserve one on 9. Their shit. That came out bloody awful, didn't it? I must sound like an absolute bitch. I used you and tossed you aside. The cold of the North these last few months have given me time to think. Maybe I was wrong. No, I am wrong. I miss you. Meanwhile in the North, what ve you got there? Nothing. Eleanor yelped and hastily crumpled the parchment in her fist just in time. Not a moment later Ramsay Bolton came tromping back into camp, a brace of fresh rabbits slung over his shoulder. He deposited them roughly at her feet and took one for himself. Eleanor didn't have the heart to watch him work. Chilled as she was, winter was coming and the cold seemed to bite right through her fur cloak. The wind wasn't the only thing biting tonight either. If the wolven cries in the distance were any indication, that wouldn't happen to be a love letter by any chance. Would it? Just like that, the shield maiden found herself dragged back. Without thinking, she hurled her message into the flame. Her heart gave a small cry of protest. Too little, too late. She could only watch helplessly as her own words curled and blackened amidst the fire's darkening to so much ash beneath the withering heat of the flame. As I said, it's nothing. You needn't concern yourself. It certainly looked like something. Ramsay said. Must you keep pressing this? So silence loomed between them. I think I've finally figured you out, he said abruptly. Irritated, she growled. What, you're a talker? The heir to the Dreadfort continued, still skinning the hair. A much better talker than Theon Greyjoy. At that I had to peel a few bits off him before he started talking. But you, the knife waved up at her as he continued his work, chuckling. I didn't even have to touch you to figure you out. Not that I would. Of course, he amended at her burning glare. I know another man's leavings. When I see them, it's quite clear you're still. What's the word? He paused, considering. Besotted with him, shall we say? Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her very veins. I don't care one whit about that idiot. Ramsay looked at her for a long, excruciating moment. Then he barked out a laugh. I think we both know that's a lie. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the fire. Do you? I do. And you think you know him? I certainly do. Eleanor bristled. You know nothing. She wasn't expecting him to laugh in her face. Do I look like Jon Snow to you? No, I didn't think so. Tell me, do you like stories? Eleanor. He must have interpreted her silence as a yes, for the Bolton began weaving his tale right then and there. When he was younger, his father sent him and his sister to be fostered in the North for a time. I didn't know him. Them neither did the North. Stannis preferred it that way. His dark eyes took on a distant look, as if he were remembering events long since forgotten. The next day I watched him hurl a man from the top of the Dreadfort without flinching. Another time he broke near every bone in a man's body and fed him to my father's hounds. Exciting, I know, but the best part by far, her startled exclamation. He continued. He did it in full view of everyone. He wouldn't tsk. Ramsay chided her. I haven't finished. He turned to me then while the dogs were still busy munching on the man's bits, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at me right through me like I wasn't even there. I thought to myself, there's a man you don't want as an enemy, so I endeavored to become his friend instead. It wasn't hard. We shared similar interests. After all, he just felt ashamed of them at first, that was all. But do you know why he killed those men? What his reasons were? Eleanor shook his head. The first made the mistake of insulting his little sister. Ramsay's gleeful tone dropped, adopting a more somber note. The second, he had more physical intentions in mind. Of course he didn't know they were the children of a lord, but more the fool him then for making the attempt. An angry red fist gripped her heart. Why are you telling me this? So you understand, the Bolton answered. You can't love the man without loving the monster, because no matter how much he might try to hide it, he is a monster, not like me. Oh no, he's far worse. My dear old friend would butcher all of King's Landing if he thought it would keep beloved family safe. No matter how much he wishes it were otherwise, how much you might want to deny it, he is a killer. But that's why you left him, wasn't it? You couldn't handle the truth, and no, you feel regret. How quaint. Now that Tyrell, what was her name? Marjorie. I suspect she has no such reservations. Certainly not someone like Daenerys Stormborn. Something twisted inside of Eleanor, then a black pearl of anger springing out of the locked door. That was her heart snarling. She leaped to her feet and drew her blade. How dare you! She didn't make it very far. No sooner had she thought to move the sword from its sheath than a black blur slammed into her from behind, smashing her into the dirt. A furious growl snarled against her ear. I could of course have you killed for this, Ramsay remarked quietly over the baying of his hounds, unflinching in the face of her implicit threat. My dogs aren't exactly hungry right now, but I'm sure they'd make do. Don't you think that would be much easier? I'd be doing the prince a favor, but he'd never forgive me for it, and if you were to disappear I'd follow soon after. So no, I don't think I'll be taking you up on your suicidal request. You won't? To her surprise, the weight fell away, and she was allowed to climb to her feet. No, I won't, Ramsay replied, but I am going to give you some advice. If you think this romantic adventure of yours has a happy ending, you haven't been paying much attention. You've a choice to make: be there for him, all of him, or let him go. If you don't, your weakness will get him killed, and that's one thing I won't abide by. With that, he turned his attention back to his hounds and seemed to forget she even existed despite herself. The shield maiden shuddered anew. Ramsay Bolton, the one-time bastard, claimed he was on Naruto's side, but Eleanor didn't trust him. There was just something wrong about that one. Even the Honorable Robb Stark had spoken little of him before he'd sent her off with him. Enemies made for strange bedfellows certainly, but she was beginning to think Bolton's boy wasn't well sane. Just the other day he'd flayed a pair of Lannister's scouts near Harrenhal for daring to bar their passage. They hadn't lasted long under the knife. At least now they had a new bearing by which to search. It wouldn't be long now once she brought the Stark girl back to Winterfell. What would she do exactly? Join Robb in his hunt for Bran and Rickon? No, she decided she would go south to King's Landing, where she would throw herself at Naruto's feet and beg for forgiveness. Just the thought of it was galling. Not the act of debasing herself before a man, not one she cared for so dearly, but how she had tossed him aside and fled at the first sign of danger. He wouldn't be happy with her. Hadn't she been the one to wound him with her words, her acts, her deeds, lacking even the nerve to admit it to his face? And now that he'd been betrothed, now that he had other women in his life, her heart had the nerve to be jealous. For what? That he'd moved on, found someone else. She had been a fool. It only remained to be seen how Naruto would react when she finally admitted it to him. At best he might forgive her, at worst she didn't want to think about what might happen days later in King's Landing, a small eternity later, and Naruto was doing his absolute best to avoid his lord father until he recovered. It was for this reason, and this reason alone, that the son of the Stag found himself slumming the streets of Flea Bottom in full armor, captive princess in tow. He couldn't trust her to the Red Keep by herself, not with the guards being mostly Baratheon and the sheer amount of ill will amongst his father's men. He couldn't risk her coming to harm, no matter that it might solve his problems, no matter how easy it would be. He simply couldn't bring himself to callously kill someone who'd been caught in Littlefinger's net. Now, despite Baelish's blunder, or was it Naruto knew he hadn't explicitly been banished from the keep, he would be allowed to return in, but in the same vein he knew he wasn't on his father's good side either, and why should he be? For the last dragon to arrive almost immediately after her threatened the king, well, it didn't look good. Daenerys Targaryen presented a unique problem and opportunity. Littlefinger argued if one was willing to risk its solidarity. After all, it was hard to see the wisdom in it. Unless there was no wisdom, was that it then? Was this all part of his plan? Bring the last Targaryen into King's Landing, then stand back and watch as the world ripped itself over who deserved the Iron Throne? If so, he was doing a splendid job of it. But no, Baelish insisted that his loyalties lie ever with the Baratheons, and for the time being Naruto was inclined to trust him. Well, not trust, more like watch very closely and stab to death at the first sign of disloyalty whatsoever. Eddard Stark had made that mistake. Honorable though he was in the Prince had no intention of meeting the same fate, especially when Littlefinger wanted him to marry again. To say that Naruto disagreed would have been an understatement. Marjorie was bad enough. He didn't think he could handle the last daughter of the dragon. 2 wives, the thought made him shudder. Was that even allowed? No, on second thought he didn't want to know. Damn it, why couldn't Daenerys have stayed on the other side of the sea where she belonged? Spare some silver, Lord, here, have the whole damn thing, bless you, Lord. When Naruto paused to drop yet another pouch of coin into yet another peasant's hand, Daenerys felt as if her sanity were dropping with it. It wasn't the poor her heart went out to them, it was the prince's maddening refusal to speak so much as a word to her in the last 2 hours. Once more the caravan of armored soldiers came to a grinding halt around them. Once more that damn guard nearly bowled her over his elbow, sending her all but sprawling against a cracked wall. The impudent fool even dared to leer and poke her at her with the butt of his sword as though he hadn't done it before. It wasn't hard to guess at the reason for his gaze. Keep moving, Khaleesi, he laughed. The words dripped derision, the very mockery of which made her blood boil. Dracarys one word would turn that throaty laugh into a shriek of pain. Dany nearly snapped at him outright, pausing only when she remembered the sheathed swords at her back. Drogon held no such reservations. His indignant squeak spoke volumes. From where he perched upon her shoulder, Dracarys it danced at the tip of her tongue, leashed only by the knowledge that she'd be cut down long before she could escape. Still, would it not be better to try? Anything was better than being paraded about like some doll in the custody of her enemies, forced to obey their every whim, their every fancy. Bram, Naruto's voice cut into her thoughts like a knife. A Khaleesi is a sort of queen, is she? Not her tormentor paused. I suppose so, my lord. Then as a queen, former or no, you will speak to her with respect. Apologize, but your grace, she is a what? Naruto challenged, still not looking at the unfortunate guardsman. A Targaryen, a wench, a woman, a threat, yours to torment as you please. Do continue, man, keep digging that hole. Your father whipped me for doing the right thing. The whiskered warrior turned slowly, and for a moment, just a moment, those sea blue eyes seemed to gleam red in the sun's light. With the promise of blood, so too did the stern reply of their owner. Fuck my father. Daenerys Targaryen is a guest of the court on my order, and if one more fucking word against my guest comes pouring out of your cunt mouth, I'm going to knock you senseless and send you back to the barracks without supper. She is the enum. Naruto spun and cuffed the man on the jaw before he could utter so much as another word. He dropped like a sack of potatoes, cloak flaring out behind him in a ruby-red curtain. Despite herself, Daenerys started, but none among the guard batted an eye. It seemed their loyalty was unbought at least. And I am your prince, Naruto remarked, snarling at her tormentor's prone form. I'd have expected you to learn by now. Emir Thomas the Price waved and indicated two men. Kindly escort Bram here back to his quarters. He is not to leave until the sun rises on the morrow. Let him cool his head there for an evening, perhaps he'll change his tune come morning. As the pair carried their insensate companion off, Daenerys caught Naruto's gaze. If he'd expected to impress her with that little display, he was going to be disappointed. Must you interfere in everything? She asked, eyes blazing. You would have roasted that man alive and been gutted for it before you could blink. No, I think my way was best. Don't worry, he winked impishly. You can burn whomever you like later. Come along now, Danny, we're going to be late. Danny, where are we going? Naruto laughed. You'll see. Without another word, the column of guards moved on, forcing her forward once more. Naruto's curious act of chivalry aside, the city's reaction was almost cautiously positive, better than she could have hoped for by far. Peasants stopped and stared at her, but few dared to so much as approach her, not without a good reason, she supposed. Setting aside the fear of being struck down by the prince's guards, most looked to be in quiet awe of the last Targaryen, stricken by her quiet beauty, an intense gaze. After all, she wasn't nearly the same girl who'd nearly drowned at the dock. Her rags had been stripped away and replaced with a fine dress of white blue silk, contrasting her smooth silver hair and violet eyes perfectly. In that aspect at least, she supposed she must look quite striking to them, as did the small black dragon perched on her shoulder. Drogon, while a good deal larger than his brothers Viserion and Regal, did not seem to share in his siblings' childlike delight when it came to crowds, whereas his siblings had proved curious to their new surroundings and somewhat amiable to their cages. Their dark-scaled counterpart hadn't taken captivity kindly, so here he was perched upon her shoulder, doing his damnedest to look intimidating before their captors. Hungry too, it had been a long morning and she hadn't yet had a chance to feed him. Daenerys gave him a tiny bit of meat from her pouch to satiate his hunger, and her offspring snatched it up with a bit more ferocity than was necessary. Naruto arched an eyebrow at the display of dominance, and the single gesture conveyed more than words ever could. Perhaps he knew Drogon loathed him. The little beast hated him. Ashamed, Drogon didn't like the guards either, because they kept looking at him. He could sense their fear, another reason to suspect that the little guy wasn't good with people, much less a dozen armed men and women, which meant imprisonment wasn't a long-term option. Given how quickly dragons grew, they'd have to be given freedom to range somehow, something to remember at any rate. Even so, Naruto kept his hand on his sword just in case. One dragon was certainly a tempting target for the poorest of thieves, but 3 would prove irresistible. As such, his brothers were under strict personal guard back at his quarters, protected by those he trusted. Jorah Mormont was not among that number. For all his supposed loyalty, Naruto couldn't bring himself to trust a man who would so easily turn his coat. He had been tasked with spying on Daenerys, only to switch sides when her life was threatened, and then the truth of what he'd been doing had come out. Daenerys hadn't been pleased now that he was finally back in Westeros, and the truth was out. Who knew where his true loyalties lay? No, he would stay locked away with the dragons for his own safety, provided the dragons didn't roast him. As if sensing that very thought, Drogon hissed at him. Naruto hissed right back, just try it, Scales. Dany rolled her eyes. Minutes passed in relative silence as they walked unhurried by the prince's retinue. More than once Naruto stopped to speak to some misbegotten urchin or beggar, offering them kind words or what gold he had on him at an opportunity. Daenerys watched him closely, scrutinizing his every move. For all his bark and bite, the prince truly seemed to have a soft spot for the city's poor. He gave of his wealth richly, freely, asked for nothing in return, and moved on. More than a few cast curious glances her way, but apparently the loud clink of golden dragons was enough to deter Their curiosity for the time being even seemed sincere. It finally proved enough to loosen her tongue. "Why do you give so freely?" she asked. "You wouldn't do the same." "Of course I would. I feel bad for them," he admitted, sighing into the silence. "And I've loot to spare. After all the shit I've done, may as well put it to good use." How from her limited understanding the crown was in severe debt to the Iron Bank fleeced the crap out of the Lannisters. "Before I off them," Naruto snickered softly then openly. When her baffled stare persisted, "Then I visited the Ironborn. Balon had the shiniest trinkets hidden away." He wiggled a gloved hand, smiling. "Also I may or may not have sticky fingers. When it comes to shiny things you'd be amazed how well gold and silver encrusted crap sell these days." "And what of it?" A spark of irritation danced in Naruto's eyes, hot and angry, almost as if he were speaking to another. "Better for it to go to the poor than stuck-up nobles who fritter it away on jewels and horse." Her jaw locked, the protest stilling on her tongue. When they finally reached their destination, the last Targaryen found herself drew up short. She didn't recognize the establishment with its stout appearance and light walls, but she did recognize the manner of men and women lounging against the walls, their provocative poses, tight clothing leaving little to the imagination. "A brothel?" Yup. Naruto stepped past her without so much as a backwards glance. "You've brought me to a brothel?" Danny repeated, crossing her arms. "It's not what you think," he insisted, holding the door open for her. "We're meeting someone here." "Several someones, actually." The smallest flicker of defiance ignited, but she held her tongue and allowed herself to escort it inside. Once within, it was no small matter to ignore the events transpiring around them. It was all she could do to ignore them and keep Drogon calm. Easier said than done, as the constant wash of smells and sounds had him squirming in her arms. "Why a brothel?" she murmured aloud. Misdirection. Naruto grinned merrily, stepping around a velvet cushion. "Everyone expects a brothel when they're fishing for information." She averted her gaze as they edged around a rather curvaceous woman clad in little more than transparent silks. "Naturally they'd think we'd avoid such an establishment, so no one expects us to meet a tone, and if someone does try to confront us, well, I'd like that too. That makes no sense." "Precisely." With that he drew a dark red curtain aside, and together they stepped through. Ulrich followed them, the great Goliath blackly muttering something about the drapery. Two of their entourage peeled away to parts unknown, while the rest lingered just beyond the door, uncertain. "That'll be all, boys," Naruto called back through the veil, flinging a pouch of coin in his wake, nimbly caught by one spry among them. "Take the rest of the afternoon off on me." That being said, he spun back through the arch and marched across the threshold, a light spring in his step. It didn't take Daenerys long to realize why an unlikely pair waited them within, seated at a large table with 3 chairs vacant. A eunuch and a dwarf, of all things. Daenerys recognized neither of them, of course. "No, wait," she told a lie. She had met the bald one in passing, but she didn't exactly know him at a glance. Yet the short one raised a glass in the prince's direction, and the man returned it with a smile as he moved to their table. It seemed he knew them after all. Ulrich prodded her forwards, but gently, mindful of his prince's earlier admonishments. Drogon snarled, and she calmed him with a light touch to his crest and followed her host. "Ah, there you are," the dwarf cried. "Come have a drink with us." "I don't think that's a good idea," Naruto was saying as she drew near. "And why not? Drinking makes me angry, and you wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Besides, where's Littlefinger?" He claimed business elsewhere. Varys sighed. "Pity, I'm sure he did." Varys, Naruto growled, "I'm tempted to take his little finger and more. Besides, all in good time, sire." The spider reassured him. By then she had drawn near enough to gain their notice. Lord Varys, for she was now certain that this was indeed the infamous spider, merely inclined his head politely and stood to pull out a chair for her. The dwarf's reaction soon proved more spectacular when he saw her. Tyrion sucked in a sharp breath and gawped at her goggle-eyed. He continued to stare as she slipped into the seat. More aptly, he stared at Drogon. His mouth worked wordlessly for a few moments, as though he were trying to find the words. Finally Naruto nudged him with an elbow, and the Lannister seemed to recover himself. "It is an honor to finally meet you, my lady," he began slowly. "I've heard a great deal about you. She's a lot less intimidating in person." Naruto snorted. Daenerys nodded and schooled herself into silence, lest she say something she might regret. Inevitably the dwarf's gaze was drawn back to Drogon. "May I?" There was something childlike in his wonder, something that softened her heart. In the end the mother of dragons relented and eased the dragon onto the table. Freed from her arms, the young dragon immediately claimed a place right in the center, craning his head about before settling on the imp in question. Slowly, hesitantly, Tyrion reached forward against her, while the faintest of smiles drew at Dany's lips. Wonderment and awe. Now this was something she understood. Drogon preened happily, no doubt fiercely proud of the attentive awe the dwarf was paying him. He didn't resist in the slightest when the hand of the king stroked his crest, dared to run a palm across his leathery little wing. The dragon trilled in content. "When I was a child," Tyrion murmured softly, "and uncle asked what gift I wanted for my name day, I begged him for one of you." As if in an answer, Drogon tilted his long neck, allowing the Lannister to scratch his chin. "Wouldn't even have to be A big dragon. I told him it could be little like me. Everyone laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. My father told me the last dragon had died a century ago. I cried myself to sleep that night. But here you are. Careful, Naruto warned as he took a drink. He bites only imbeciles, Danny declared proudly. Drogon chirped in agreement. Hey, how are your wounds, my lord? Varys asked, restraining a smile. At the sight, you seem to be faring better than yesterday. Danny's smile shattered like glass. They itch now and then, Naruto reluctantly admitted, pawing at the back of his neck. Still worth it if you ask me. But did the old man have to whip me for it? You did bring her into the court, Tyrion pointed out, finally taking his eyes off Drogon. Not a wise move that. And what, pray tell, should I have done? What exactly? The scarred assassin answered before downing another glass with vigor. Throw her in the sea, for the sharks were men, not animals. Besides, I told you that was Littlefinger's doing, not mine. Seems he took me literally when I asked him for the last dragons and all the golden bravos. He guffawed when Drogon nipped at his little finger. You and me both, little guy. You'd think the bloody fool would know the difference between sarcasm and sense by now. Despite herself, Daenerys flushed. No, stop. She schooled her face into a mask of impassivity. She would not be taken for a fool. All this charity and kindness, it was an illusion, a facade, a farce. It must be the very idea that a complete stranger would go so far for her was sheer anathema to her. No one had shown her kindness like this before. No one had accepted a whipping for her. None had stepped between her and the noose without asking for anything in return. Suppose I believe you for a moment, she ventured slowly, warily catching his eye. Did you really not have a hand in this? What conspired to bring you here? Nope. The whiskered prince flashed a small rueful smile. We have our resident schemer to thank for that. I'll have to ask him why he did it. Once I put him on the rack. One bastard to another. Are you really a bastard? Just about, Naruto confessed with a shrug. He saw no point in keeping it from her, as it was in every sense of the word naturalized and elevated above my stations. But enough about me. I brought you here so we could talk about you. What are your plans? What do you intend to do? Indignation flashed through her at the word plans. She had but one. I will have justice, she declared. Varys frowned thoughtfully. Against whom, might I ask? Daenerys felt herself frown. Did they not understand? Against those who wronged me. Of course. I'm afraid you won't find much in the way of satisfaction there, Tyrion lamented, draining his mug. Robert Baratheon's long dead, his sons as well. The Kingslayer, my dear brother, mind you, languishes in the black cells alongside my dearest sister. If you've come here to kill Stannis in his stead, you might be disappointed to kill him. That very same glass tilted in Naruto's direction. You'll have to go through this one first. Trust me when I say you would have better luck convincing me to give up wine. And why is that? Naruto groaned. Must we list my exploits now? Trust me, my dear. Now it was the turn of Varys to interject. Some things are better left unsaid. You'd be wise to let this vendetta go when the time comes, Daenerys replied, bristling at the patronizing tone. I will take back what is mine with fire and blood. Naruto scoffed. A bit late for that, innit? We already took King's Landing. Don't be rude. Better to be friends now than enemies later, right? Look, I'll be honest, I really don't want to kill you. This was to be your home once, you know. At least it was supposed to be before that shit with the Mad King. Bottom line, you have as much right to be here as anyone else in the Red Keep. Even so, why do you say we let bygones be bygones and stop snapping at one another like rabid dogs? He offered her his hand, beaming. Truce put off by his affable nature. Nevertheless, Daenerys couldn't bring herself to refuse. If this was a ruse of some sort, guys, to get her to let her guard down, it was an elaborate one. She just didn't. I accept your terms, she conceded. For now, good enough. To the last Targaryen, Naruto cried, raising his glass in a toast. Tyrion and Varys echoed him a moment later. Long may she live. So intent were they on their little celebration that none seemed to notice Daenerys did, registering as little more than a blot of brown and cloth in her peripheral. She saw it all the same. So did Drogon, bristling beneath Tyrion's hand with a furious hiss. At that, Tyrion turned, followed by Varys and finally Naruto himself. Bugger, the latter muttered, numbering 7 in all. They were a ragged yet oddly uniform-looking bunch. Some were bald, others shaved, some even carried makeshift weapons in hand. All wore the rough sacked clothes of beggars, however, and every one looked to be rather displeased, more so as they advanced on their little gathering. Whether they were cross with her or someone else remained to be seen. Sure enough, Ulrich straightened in the corner, but remained otherwise silent when his commander cast him a glance and stood. I'm afraid this is a private party, gents. Naruto made a dismissive gesture with his offhand. To what do we owe the courtesy? Their leader, a man distinguished by a scar running the length of his right eye, the High Sparrow, requests your presence. Does he now? Naruto blinked, tilting his head to the right like a curious fox. I've heard all sorts of things about the old bird these last few days, and now he wants to meet me. I'm flattered. Really, what might the reason be? Daenerys froze as the scent of spirits hit her dead in the face. 7 stars. How much had he to drink? This wasn't going to end well. We will take the lady as well. Daenerys started as she came back to herself. For the nerve of these. Naruto frowned. And what does he plan to do with us? Your father has profaned our faith. The faith of our fathers and forefathers, one of the robed men intoned gravely. He is a sinner, you are a sinner, you shall be punished. Naruto's smile thinned. You didn't answer the rest of my question. That is not of your concern. Naruto and Tyrion exchanged a glance. The former smiled. Whoever do you think he's talking about? He whispered conspiratorially. We both have rather nasty fathers, don't we? Tyrion polished off his mug. Considering my father, I suppose you have a point. Well then, gentlemen, who are you here for? The men dithered, momentarily flummoxed by this turn of pace. As I said, we are here for. That moment of confusion was all they needed. Naruto took hold of the table's edge and upended it with a delighted shout, sending Mug's ale and a very angry Drogon flying into the air. Even as Tyrion and Varys shrank back to the wall, the nearest sparrow soon learned precisely why one must never ever anger a dragon. Alas, he didn't live long enough to realize his mistake, nor would he ever be able to. A face full of napalm tends to remedy that. The rest of his brethren, though wary of Drogon, alas, proved even more foolish than their brother in their pursuit of the prince. Daenerys felt a small surge of pride for him. Then Naruto retreated nimbly backward over the wrecked table as a sparrow struck an embladed club, passing through empty air. But when the rest moved to follow him, Ulrich was simply there, interposing himself between the prince and the leader of the brigands, arms loose at his side. Silent fury, that was all Daenerys could think to describe him, as his bearded visage fixed upon the robed men, dark eyes inscrutable. He was no Gregor Clegane certainly, but in that moment even the dreaded Mountain himself would have been hard-pressed to match the menace this man exuded in his dark shadow plate. He didn't move, nay, he had no need to, but the sparrows halted as though they'd run into a wall of living steel. The leader of the band turned a stern glance upon Naruto, his lips pursed in a thin line. Order your man to step aside, sir, or there will be more violence. The prince arched an eyebrow. You barge into our little celebration unannounced, threaten me and my guests, and intend to make off with my lady. His smile faded, lips pulling back to expose white teeth in a snarl. Do you know what I choose in the end? His reply didn't surprise Daenerys Stormborn not in the least. I choose violence. Ulrich was very fast, near blindingly so for a man of his size and the time that it took the nearest sparrows to swing his weapon. The poor fellow had already sealed his fate. He simply didn't know it yet. His cudgel glanced off the polished breastplate with a hollow clang that left his arms trembling. Fine armor that startled. The sparrow made another attempt, only to find a massive hand wrapped around his throat. Ulrich hoisted him aloft with ease, as if he weighed no more than a child, strangling the life from him until the man's entire body shook, the club clattering out of his grasp to the floor. But it didn't end there. With an uninterested grunt, the stoic Umber hurled his unfortunate victim to the ground and stalked after him. The sparrow had just enough time for one last strangled grasp before strong fingers found purchase on his face and slammed his skull into the floor, securing themselves under his chin like thick meaty fishhooks. Then Ulrich pulled once, twice, thrice. Rip. On the final tug, the man's head came free with a wet pop, neck and all snapped at the base of his spine. Ulrich stared at his prize for a moment. As it contemplating it, thus satisfied, he let the body fall twitching to the ground, uncaring for the spreading stain in the carpet. A flick of his wrist sent the severed head twirling to land at the sparrow's feet. Of their once supreme confidence there was nothing to be seen yet. Still they did not depart, whether from fear or something else she knew not. Naruto wasn't having it. What was the word again? Oh right, Dracarys, motherfucker. To her surprise, Drogon answered the call and inhaled deeply. No wait, that was all the lead sparrow managed before his world erupted into flame. The denizens of Littlefinger's brothel would come to name the catastrophe as the day of fire, for the shrieks that rose from that room would etch themselves into the minds of many. Rumors and tales would spread from the incident and become wildly exaggerated tales of witchcraft and magic and all manner of ghastly things, cementing a fear of the Stag and his so-called son for generations to come. In the end of the sparrows there was only a single survivor, a half-singed man who'd retained enough sense to smother the flames with a carpet. Remarkably, Naruto didn't kill him. Instead, he knelt before the quaking soul and placed a hand on his shoulder. Please tell the High Sparrow that he's welcome to visit me whenever he likes. He spoke kindly in the Red Keep personally. Daenerys watched the man skitter away and duck outside, restraining a smile of her own. Unexpected, the High Valyrian, or letting the poor bastard live. Both. Naruto clicked his tongue as Drogon clambered back onto her shoulder. Like I said, I enjoy learning languages. You'd be surprised at all the colorful curses one can say in High Valyrian. As to the sparrow, he cast a glance back to the scorched remains of the man's compatriots. Consider it a warning for our dear High Sparrow. He made his move and I made my counter move. Now it's his turn. Varys coughed quietly. Now that you've had your fun, perhaps we should return to the keep. It would not do for us to be connected with this incident. Tyrion sighed quietly. The king won't like this. Fuck the king. Naruto spat. If the High Sparrow wants to raise a ruckus again, I'll be sure to remind him that I've been feeding half this city out of my own damn pocket. That should quiet him. Shall we go then? Naruto beamed. We shall. With that he offered Daenerys his elbow, and to her surprise she found herself accepting, hooking her arm within as perhaps given time she could make use of this Baratheon bastard. For her own means the scales were tipping once again. Marjorie Tyrell knew this, yet try as she might she couldn't find a way to tip them back in her favor. She was a master of playing the great game, and a long one at that, but even she could see that this threatened disaster had begun so long ago, with Renly's death at the hand of some shadowy assassin followed shortly by news Stannis' impending assault of King's Landing. For a time it had seemed that they would ally with Lannisters and drive them and the Starks back into the sea. Then, miracle of miracles, father renounced his loyalty to Tywin and joined Stannis. Instead, the siege swiftly silenced with a Lannister defeat, the king slain, and all of the none had expected it. But there it was, the scales had tipped then, just as they were tipping now. Some time ago the queen had taken to her bed from an unknown illness, wasting away to nothingness at an alarming pace. The maesters spoke of disease, but others claimed poison meant for the King's cup. She'd quietly passed away yesterday, perishing in her sleep. Few knew of the tragedy, fewer dared to speak of it in the king's presence. Stannis had gone into mourning. Worse, he had forsworn all comforts and openly declared the unthinkable. He would not remarry now or ever again, and why should he? He already had an heir. Thus the eventual burden of ruling fell to Naruto, an heir whose father had brutally flogged him only a fortnight ago for allowing a lone girl to return to the one place she should never be, an heir who had just set half a dozen men aflame for trying to kidnap him, a man she could barely understand, much less hope to control. She hadn't a clue who this High Sparrow was or what he and his followers had done to irk the prince, and she didn't much care, but clearly they must have done something, because he'd come back from Flea Bottom smug and smelling of smoke and wine. With that infernal Targaryen girl in tow, she thought herself secure. If she was to marry the prince, then it stood to reason that she would become queen. There was no one else to catch his eye. Then she'd been quite confident in her charms, her wiles, her beauty, and the skills that came with it. It was a confidence born not out of arrogance, she told herself, but knowledge, the knowledge that no man could say no to her. Now she found even that threat and charm the young man grandmother had told her appeal to his dignity, and if he lacks that lust. But Naruto was no Joffrey or even Tommen, easily manipulated by such base whims, and had taken every ounce of wit and charm she'd possessed just to goad him to bed. She was under no illusion that she controlled Naruto, for to control him was to put reins on the wind itself. Impossible at best. She could steer him in a given direction, and even then not for very long. She'd caught him in a moment of weakness, nothing more. That moment of weakness had left her sore and unable to walk properly for several days, not in an unpleasant way, mind you. The prince had proven himself a very capable lover beneath the sheets. She had even come to care for him in a way, for he was just as broken as she did. She loved him. She might learn to do so given time, but Naruto clearly saw something in this Targaryen, and try as she might to ignore it, the idea of being ignored, it galled her. Daenerys had no army, no nation, nothing to offer them, but she did have her dragons. Those alone were a powerful bargaining chip, enough to guarantee her safety. Perhaps anyone could see the terrors they'd become given time. Marjorie respected that move. Better to have the last dragons with them rather than against. What she did not respect was the need for their mother and the implicit threat she presented to her rule. She didn't want to just be queen, she wanted to be the queen, and she couldn't rightly do so with that loose end lying about. Or could she? Daenerys Targaryen, she'd might just have answer for her. After all, little did she know that her problems were only just beginning. Word was eventually sent to Dorne in form of a gracious invitation, and a reply returned hot on its heels. Some days afterward we would be honored to meet him. In the end, Stannis was left to mull precisely what the vague words implied: meet whom? Him, his son, or perhaps the mountain himself. Qyburn had proved instrumental in keeping that beast restrained. It helped that he lacked such scruples, yet there were precious few beyond himself and his son who could hope to subdue such a beast without the drugs in his system, and his father and son became increasingly preoccupied with the task of managing a flagging kingdom, the latter taking great pains to avoid him altogether. The likelihood of this became more and more unlikely. Other thoughts dwelled as well, dark thoughts heavier than the weight of the Iron Throne and the responsibilities that came with it, matters he regretted deeply. At times he wondered if he'd been too hard on the boy that day, if he'd made a mistake in punishing him for sheltering the Targaryen girl. Naruto had always been one to stand by his morals, gray though they might be at times, and there had always been a bit of a gap between them in that regard. Stannis saw things one way, black and white, his bastard son the other, but he was his son, and he'd hurt him. Perhaps for the first time in his life he'd hurt Shireen too. By doing it she still wouldn't speak to him. Naruto seldom did either. When he did, it was often terse and curt. Why didn't they understand? He'd done it for the man's own good, to teach him a lesson, to remind him that the world couldn't be gray, not when you were king. Part of him hoped he'd understand that lesson. Now something was different. He'd seen it in his eyes. The boy was angry. Something had hardened in him since that fateful day, and Stannis wasn't entirely certain he liked what he saw. The situation made all the more tenuous thanks to his vow Celes' death still shook him to this very day, a black cloud that hung over his thoughts whenever he was wary of fog, difficult to lift poison. It should have been him she drank from his cup and paid the price. He would subject no other to that risk so long as he could help it. Had no intention of marrying again unless it was absolutely necessary. Perhaps Lady Melisandre? No, that was madness. What was he thinking? Regardless of his thoughts, this matter with the mountain would be settled one way or another. The brute would go to Dorne in a bloody box if that was what it took. 100 Dornish men arrived no less than a week later with Prince Oberyn at their head. Their presence was unannounced and thus caught King's Landing by surprise. If only for the volume number of men, they took up residence in the royal quarters and awaited an audience with the crown prince at the first opportunity. Naruto, not him. Under any other circumstance, Stannis would have been displeased by such a blatant rebuttal. But he knew in his heart that he simply didn't possess the spirit of a negotiator. He believed in black and white. There was seldom a gray. Naruto, on the other hand, the boy thrived in grays. He liked to imagine that the poor boy would be perfectly at home amongst the wild-blooded folk. Loath as he might be to admit it, his son might be half mad, but he knew how to play peacekeeper. When it suited him didn't mean he was going to like it, though. This is a bad idea. Nonsense, Tyrion declared winningly as the sound of boots drew closer along the hall. You'll do just fine. Fine was a relative term, of course, speaking. The hand of the king expected this to be an absolute catastrophe. How Stannis honestly expected them to greet the Dorne contingent like this, he had no idea. In his mind it was disaster waiting to happen, and soon. If Naruto had anything to say about it, needless to say, the prince was not pleased with his outfit of choice. Not a bit. I feel like a fleeced idiot with his dick hanging out, Naruto growled crassly, adjusting his absurdly bright doublet for what felt like the umpteenth time. His sole solace was that it was his favorite color, orange, and even that did little to soothe his temper. How do people fight in these, let alone breathe? I can barely move my arms. He fluttered the tight velvety sleeves for emphasis, straining at the stitches. See, how can I dodge a knife in this getup? How, I ask you? You can't. Well, someone should change that. The prince groused, crossing his arms. Aw shit, I think I just tore something. Fuck, Bronn guffawed. See, this is why I don't dress up. Ulrich boomed, a laugh of his own behind his helm. Prefer armor myself sturdier. See, the Sellsword argued. I'd agree with you there, but all that plate too heavy. Leather is better. Lighter lets you move around and get skewered up the ass. Ulfric replied flatly. Not if you're quick about it. Speaking from experience. Are we easy there, big guy? Tyrion suppressed a groan. Hopeless. The lot of them smiles now. Everyone. The hand of the king reminded him, and do try to behave. We wouldn't want to start a war. Naruto muttered something unflattering in Dothraki. That means you, the prince hissed through clenched teeth, but otherwise held his tongue as the door swung open to admit their guests. Prince Oberyn was not an ugly man by any measure. Indeed, he was quite handsome. Exceedingly flanked by a pair of Dornishmen, he strode into the room as though he owned it. He paid no attention for the guard or even Tyrion himself, all ignored without so much as a passing glance. He had eyes only for one. A roguish grin flashed across his face the moment he caught sight of Naruto, chafing as he was in the doublet. 3 swift strides carried him across the room, and before anyone could react he spread his arms wide and embraced the man as though he were a long-lost brother. Urka, and here you are at last. Laughing, he clapped his fellow prince on the back once more and released him. The hero of the hour, champion of Dorne. Everyone blinked, Naruto included. What I admit, Oberyn confessed happily. You've become something of a legend in my country thanks to your exploits. The man who destroyed the Lannisters in a single night. The shadow of fire, it has a nice ring to it, wouldn't you agree? You even have Tywin's children alongside the mountain. No, oh, the delicious irony. Naruto brightened immediately at the talk of war and all its spoils. Put them there myself. You're free to pay them a visit, not wanting to subject either of his siblings to such a thing. Tyrion struggled to rein the pair in. Pardon me, my lord, but may I present, and there is someone I would like you to meet. Before anyone could argue, Oberyn clapped his hands together. Come in, my dear. All eyes turned as a shadow detached itself from the hall and entered the room. It was a terribly rare thing indeed when the sight of a woman could leave Naruto so speechless, but this beauty did all that to him and more. Warm eyes framed by dark curls held his with careless ease, dusky skin and flawless curves, all concealed within a lavender and dark curls. All she was a creature of near peerless beauty, so much so that he found himself at a loss for words. She smiled disarmingly at him, and he felt something inside him melt. A great effort focused his attention on Oberyn was more. Sure enough, the rogue all flashed him a knowing grin. May I present my darling niece, Princess Arya Nimrose Martell, the beautiful goddess. Curtsies deeply. I am honored, your grace. Naruto opened his mouth to return such platitudes, paused, considered, sighed. Fuck it, I'm entirely too sober for this shit. Who wants a drink? Oberyn laughed. I like this one already. Time skip. Burn them all. Don't you understand? She isn't here. Burn them all. Let me through. Burn them all. Cersei. Naruto jolted awake with a Lannister's name lingering on his lips, sword in hand and swinging weight. That wasn't a sword in his hand, but a mangled pillow, and this wasn't the September of Baylor, but his own quarters. There was that infernal boar head mounted on the wall, the dart through its eye. There was Sir Pounce curled up at the foot of the bed sound asleep. There was the candle in his desk long since extinguished. He could feel the gentle night breeze of the sea wafting in from his open window, wrapping across his bare chest in reassuring comfort. All of it was real, with that the rest of the world came back to him in fits and spurts, and his mind gradually began to accept that it had all been just that, another of his dreams, albeit a particularly nasty one. His body refused to believe it entirely, however, and his heart still hammered from the rush of fire and blood he'd experienced. Both of his forearms throbbed, angrily protesting burns he remembered but could not see. It wasn't real, he reminded himself desperately. Again he'd been dreaming of the future, again one untouched by the events of today, but a future. All the same, he'd seen them burn, seen them all burn, consumed in a wall of green fire. Felt it as that mad woman looked on, enjoying a glass of wine. On some level he knew it was a dream. It had to be. This had never happened. Cersei languished in the black cells beneath the keep. She was never getting out, so why did he feel so uneasy? Naruto, the prince started slightly when someone called out to him, his already raw senses shrieking in alarm as the sheets stirred beside him. A hand leaped to the compartment where he'd hid his knife, stilling only as a pair of slim arms wound across his chest. Even then he nearly fought them off until he felt her press against his back, until he realized who was holding him. Her chin rested against his collarbone as she breathed, her head heavy against his own, the auburn curtain of her hair tickling at his nose, inviting pleasant memories to blunt the terror that consumed him. You were shouting in your sleep, she murmured against his shoulder. Is everything all right? Slowly, painfully, Naruto exhaled. Bad dream, did I wake you? You did, came the lofty reply, but given the circumstances I'm inclined to forgive you. Right, he reminded himself. Marjorie, she'd come to his bed again. He'd almost forgotten. What did it matter anyway? They were to be wed soon enough. Of course she would be here, trying to secure her position as his wife when so many were clamoring for his affection. Daenerys had a room of her own, and he didn't trust Arianne one bit, not after he'd and Oberyn had gotten themselves thoroughly soused and wound up in a brothel. He remembered nothing of that day, but secretly suspected he might have done something he regretted. He wasn't fool enough to risk a stranger in his bed again. Marjorie at least could be counted on not to slit his throat in his sleep, because without him she'd never ever dream of becoming queen. Ambition made for a strange bedfellow, but in this instant he was glad she was here. In this moment he needed comfort. He turned and cupped her face for a long tender moment, gently thumbing her cheek with his fingers. Struck by a surprising longing, he leaned forward and kissed her. Marjorie started at this, momentarily taken aback by this unexpected turn of event, but returned his passion with equal fervor, gasping as he slid into her fingers, digging into her hips. Their coupling was brief and frenetic and fierce, such that she found herself all but swept away by it, surrendering control and yielding to his every whim. What did you dream about? She asked as he held her curled together. Some time later Naruto was silent for a very long time, so long in fact that she suspected he'd fallen asleep. When he spoke, it was barely a whisper. You died, he said. I died, everyone died we knew, and there was nothing we could do. Marjorie's heart lurched. There was the chink in his armor she'd been seeking all this time. She need only say the right words and she'd have sway over him. It would be easy. Broken men were easy to control once you knew their weakness, and he'd just revealed it to her. He feared fire, he feared death. The voices in his head, those were normal fears, fears she could capitalize on, use to her advantage, but she just couldn't bring herself to act on it. Tell me, she said instead. He growled no. She kissed him softly, her lips lingering against his cheek. Please let me help. And so he did, at great length and in every bit of blazing gory glory, right down to the last minute detail. That bitch, she surprised even herself with her own vehemence. That absolute bitch, she killed me. Me, whatever did I do to her? Seeing his smile, she steadied herself, took a deep breath, and calmed the raging storm of her anger and the emotions that within. And you have these dreams often, do they come true? You mean, can I stop them? He shot back. Can you? Marjorie asked. When I was 7 I dreamed my sword instructor cut off my hand to teach me a lesson, and he tried, so I killed him, got myself locked up away. That one, he snorted quietly. Few years later, around 15 or so, I dreamed I'd be forced to marry one of Walder Frey's girls and be miserable to my last day. So when I finally met the old bastard, I asked him if I could choose, maybe meet one I'd like. You know, didn't work, so I told him off. Aha, I've got a good one. I dreamed that Shireen would catch grayscale, so I made my old man call in every maester he could, and boom, somehow she was cured. Any more examples? A small smile flashed across her face. A few ones I'd rather not tell you about, he confessed with distant blue eyes, idly twirling a finger in her hair. It's always of the future though, never the past. Tends to be a hit or miss. Once I dreamed that I would throw myself from a window in King's Landing. In another I rode a dragon into battle and burned cities to the ground. As you can see, I haven't done either of those yet. Other times my dreams are downright accurate and immediate. For instance, I saw that my stepmother would die of poison. That happened. You don't sound sorry for her. Why the hell should I be? Naruto propped himself up On an elbow to glare at his soon-to-be bride. She was a bitch to me, and Shireen her own daughter. She beat us, whipped us, even tried to poison me once. I'd be dead if not for a very talented maester, and we wouldn't even be having the conversation. That's why it's damn fitting that someone poisoned her this time around. I'm glad she's dead. I'd dance on her grave and be the one to spit on her ashes if I could find them. Don't you know what it's like to love someone? When he didn't answer, she dared to probe deeper. Haven't you ever loved another? Naruto laughed bitterly. Love withers when it is neglected, left alone too long. Love will seek another. Her lips pursed into a thin line. That's not an answer. Fuck sake. I only truly loved 3 times. Okay. He thrust 3 fingers before her face. The first was a girl in the stables. My stepmother ordered her head chopped off. Why? Because she couldn't stand to see me happy. The second was a fry. Ironically met her during my stay with Walder Frey. She was the one I would have liked to marry. Eliza was her name. Cheeky girl with green eyes, hair darker than pitch, impish, clever and sharp as Valyrian steel. Then that cheeky dick waffle father of hers forbid her from marrying me, and she threw herself from the twins. The third might have been Eleanor, but ran away when she saw something that she didn't like in me. Clear enough for you. You loved a Frey. It took everything she had to maintain a straight face, but somehow she managed. Naruto choked, embarrassed. I was very young. Okay, can we not talk about this? Irritated at himself for the slip, he turned away from her, throwing his head onto a nearby pillow. I've had a lifetime of talking about lost loves and betrayals, and I'm sick of it. Marjorie dithered, eyes tracing his scarred shoulders. For a moment she actually considered asking him about Daenerys, about what his thoughts were pertaining to the Mother of Dragons, but that would have only made him even angrier than he already was, and she dare not risk such an attempt. She'd only just begun to win some semblance of trust from him, and any attempt to pry risked shattering that altogether. In the end she laid down beside him, stroking his back quietly. I'd never betray you, she insisted. I'm yours from this day to my last day. His only response was a grunt. We'll see. Would you like me to sing to you? Your grace, I find it helps me relax. Fine. She held him, then held him closer than he would have dared to believe possible. Marjorie stroked the back of his head quietly, murmuring sweet nothings in his ears until he finally fell asleep. In her last moments before she joined him in slumber, she remained horribly unnerved. Here was a man who feared nothing. He'd killed kings and would be kings without batting an eyelash. He'd set sparrows on fire for assaulting his friends with him. Blood and wine flowed freely, yet just now he'd been trembling like a leaf. The look in his eyes had been one of raw panic, wild and fierce, like nothing she'd ever seen. He was keeping something from her, and quite honestly she found herself afraid of that. What else could have frightened him so? Meanwhile, on the Iron Islands, Euron Greyjoy watched the Iron Fleet take shape around him, and he smiled. The Kingsmoot had gone much as planned. Even if he hadn't had the chance to kill Balon himself, the King's Shadow had done that for him, unknowingly paving the way for his glory and conquest. And what a conquest it would be! He would build a fleet such as the world had never seen, and he would make the world tremble at the Greyjoy name. In a way, he owed the bastard, owed him much. Were it not for him, he would never have learned of Balon's death so soon. Words spread quickly these days, even on the seas, and he'd returned as soon as the news reached him, all thanks to that bastard. Were it not for him, he'd never have returned as soon as he had. Were it not for him, he'd never have claimed the Salt Throne. Without a fight, no one had the gall to oppose him after he'd cut his last protester into pieces. Not even his brute of a brother Victarion. No one wanted to challenge him after that. None of them had a better plan either, though his had been waylaid somewhat upon learning that the Dragon Girl was back in King's Landing. A shame, really. He would have liked to seduce her with the Iron Fleet. They would have made for a powerful alliance. Wouldn't stop him from putting a sword through her heart, though her heart, the bastard's heart, and all others. Then with the Dragonbiter, he'd use her own dragons to rain down fire on their enemies for all time. He was the storm, the first and the last, and he would bring a storm the world had never seen. Your Grace, you are hereby cordially invited to attend the wedding of my daughter. You know, if you hadn't been such a brat to me back then, I would have gladly let you have your pick of the lot today. A shame any one of my girls would have been far quieter than the ones you seem to have surrounded yourself with. Regards, Walder Frey. Oh, Walder Frey, prickly as ever I see, and is it that time already? Time gets funny in the south, I suppose. Anywho, I'd be happy to accept your invitation, but I'm afraid I'm spoken for these days. I'll be leaving for the twins after my wedding with thousands of armed guards, elite guards who do not drink unless I tell them, soldiers who make your inbred brats look like children waving sticks, soldiers who would be more than happy to lay claim to the twins if I were to have an accident. Did I mention one of them is to be the new mountain that rides? You've heard of him, haven't you? Ulrich, of course you have. For reasons unbeknownst to me, he bears a special hatred for you in particular, and I'd just love to let him off the leash. Have I made myself clear? Thought so. Try anything and you won't live to regret it. Naruto, what do you think? Too much? Naruto asked the raven as he attached the message cylinder to its leg. Should I have toned it down a bit? The bird merely squawked, eager to leave the window ledge and fritter away into the afternoon with its brethren. It wanted nothing more than to spread its wings and soar to deliver its message. It cared not for this strange bare-chested man fretting over the contents of a letter not yet sent, but it had a task to complete, and so did not peck at his fingers when he hesitated over the parchment. Once more, I'm talking to animals again, the prince sighed, palming his face. I really am going crazy, aren't I? Of course you are. You're a beast. Why act like a man? And there were the whispers again. They'd let him be for so long now that he dared to hope. To think he was finally rid of them. Perhaps he'd been too busy to notice them, to feel those invisible fingers on his spine. It certainly didn't help that he chafed at the idea of civilized life, but even so he thought he'd finally earned some peace, a reprieve. Not so, apparently. Stop, he gritted his teeth, hands fisting against the desk with enough force to bite into the wood. I don't have time for this. Sometimes he could actually argue with the voices, convince them to let him be. On a good day he could simply drown himself in wine and ignore them entirely. Today was not one of those days. Ah, the whispers purred as his eyes burned an angry red. You want to be rid of us? That hurts, boy, it really does. After all we've done for you, you should be grateful. Yes, you should. Where would you be without us? Poisoned, dead in a ditch. Is it so wrong that we ask for favor in return? Small favors, tiny favors, yes, so tiny. Only 3 things could drive them away, even for a time: wine, wanton murder, and sex, none of which were on hand at the moment. Why resist at all? Just given, you should kill them all and be done with it. Just let me write my damn letter. I rather like it actually. A sultry voice interjected it as fire. Naruto's neck spun with such force that he actually felt something pop. How in the hell did you hear me? He demanded. How did you even get in? Never mind, I don't want to know. Ariane Martell draped herself across the door. Time skip. When the door opened, Cersei barely saw it, but she did hear it. Months of captivity in the dark had left her nearly blind, but her hearing remained sharp as ever. She heard the lock shift, heard the hinges creak open, felt the thud of boots against the ground near her face, felt it as an iron toe nudged her face, checking for signs of life. Even then she didn't move, laying prone against the cold stones. It was only when the heat of a lit torch warmed her face that she finally began to move, hiding her gaze beneath the shadow of an arm. Who is that? You're not eating, a voice remarked. Wait, she knew that voice, and it wasn't Tyrion. Through dim eyes she squinted, scowling as flame-colored hair, familiar blue eyes, and whiskered cheeks revealed themselves. She didn't even have the strength to lunge at him. Weak as she was, she could only hiss, you killed my children. Which one? Joffrey? Well, yeah. Naruto nodded, crouching down before her with a sigh. That was me. I won't lie to you. Watching your vicious bastard die gave me more relief than 1,000 bottles of wine. He was a nasty little cunt, one who took pleasure in causing others pain. The world is better without him, and I'm not sorry for that. I do regret Tommen, though he was just a boy. Get out. No. Cersei spat in his face, shrieking, I said get out. The prince fell silent at that, rubbing his face with his sleeve. He was silent for a very long time. So silent, in fact, that Cersei suspected he'd left altogether. When he finally spoke, she nearly jumped. If it's any consolation, you won. You know, I saw it. Cersei started violently. What, in my dreams? The prince explained, his face a strange blank. I saw you burn them all. You found one of the Mad King's hidden caches of wildfire beneath the September of Baelor, and you burned them all. Stannis me. Shireen Loras. Marjorie. Those blue eyes tightened in the dark, narrowing to azure slits. All of us gone in an instant. I know why you did it too, because it felt good, because you couldn't stand the thought of losing, of them winning, beating you, but above all because you wanted to protect Tom and your dear son. And you know what? I understand you do. Don't be so shocked. Even I know what it's like to love someone. The whiskered assassin lowered the torch, his blue eyes hiding themselves in shadow. Love is a fierce thing. Wild love makes you reckless, foolish. It also gives you strength, makes you dangerous. You're a monster, she snarled. You're no better. As he light footsteps heralded the arrival of another, a Dornish woman in pale silk. So this the great Cersei Lannister, she scoffed, her lips curving into frown. Disappointing. Cersei blinked slowly. Who are you? Someone who remembers, the girl hissed back. Someone who does not forget. Ariane. Naruto's voice rose in warning. I told you to wait outside. Why? I want to watch. Naruto scowled out. The princess went with a huff, but not before spitting on her. You'll have to forgive Ariane. Naruto shook his head slowly. She has a bit of a temper, but I don't see things the way she does, or the way you do. Even I don't do things because they make me feel good. I purge on occasion, yes, not because I want to, but because I must. The voice is there like steam. You see, it builds and builds and builds until I can't control myself. I lash out. A hand rose and fell, indicating something she couldn't see. I go into a rage that lasts for days, weeks, even at a time. Laughter burst out of him, bubbling up without warning. Even the sack of this city didn't calm me for long. Ha, do you know what it's like to feel like an outsider in your own skin, to lose control of your own body? You're mad. Finally see that, do you? He laughed again at her, again palming his face to hide his eyes. I do. I am. The voices, the whispers, these urges. I know it isn't me. I know it's not me, but I can't shut them off. Why are you even here? I'm here because you won. The son of the Stag confessed, looking quite contrite. Another act? No doubt as I said I saw it somehow someway you got out of this cell you won and I can't have that so I'm putting a stop to it before it starts the only I know how and I suppose you chose to threaten my brother she hissed no I chose your face must have paled because the prince hastened to explain not because it felt good because it actually doesn't at this point. I've already taken so much from you now I have to take your life as well I could have chosen your brother that would have pleased. Daenerys to no end I suspect oh hadn't you heard no of course not you've been locked down here for ages now how silly of me to forget a wan smile tugged at his whiskered cheeks still she's alive safe and out of the grasp of people like you but back to our chat the door creaked open once more causing Cersei to start I really don't relish this at all no one should have to die in the dark alone forgotten even if Tyrion understands. I know that your brother won't forgive me for this. I know Shireen will be furious with me my friends those few I still have will think me cruel I'll have to shoulder that and I will so here I am if you're going to die I should be the one to witness Qyburn a gaunt-looking man that she didn't recognize emerged from the shadows behind him this pains me my lady the maester lamented mournfully kneeling before her whatever your faults and flaws you do not deserve to die alone in such a cold dark place his frail-looking hands presented her with a small cup that all but reeked of milk of the poppy but sometimes before we can usher in the new the old must be put to rest it will be quick I promise drink he urged her folding her hands around the small cup drink and be with your children forevermore Cersei gazed at the cup quietly despondent what more did she have to live for what no a thorn of stubborn pride pricked her at the last moment and held her back no she didn't want to die she wanted vengeance she wanted to see him suffer as she had suffered. She wanted what was hers not to do this to die quietly in a cell alone and forgotten not like this she refused to die in a place like this surrounded by mere peasants they were nothing to her beneath her and they dared to presume she would yield to them after this snarling she flung the cup in the prince's face no Naruto sidestepped the projectile taken aback by the sudden defiance look. I'm trying to be merciful here it's either this or I call Bronn in here to chop your head off. And I'd really like to avoid that I refuse you treasonous little paunch she snarled her voice growing stronger with each passing moment I won't give you the satisfaction you have no right I demand a trial by combat Naruto and Qyburn exchanged a slow glance and the prince surprised her yet again he laughed I'm afraid you don't understand this isn't a trial. And you don't have a choice I tried to be the nice guy and make it painless but now I see that was a mistake Qyburn I'll hold her as you say. Your grace what no Cersei shrank back at the tone in his voice skittering as far as her chains would allow no she cried as he stormed forwards no and oh you can't do this to me she clawed at Naruto with a strength born of sheer desperation carving bloody furrows into his face with her long nails, but still he kept coming you'll never get away with it do you hear my father will have your head he something cracked across her face a moment later driving her to the floor stunned Arianne's face was the last she saw swimming in and out of focus sweet dreams little lion alas Cersei regained her senses a heartbeat too late. Hands like iron clamped across her face forced her jaw open despite her protests another pair poured something foul and clawing down her gullet more of that potion against her while her body swallowed both hands fell away and Cersei spat at them she choked and gagged at the taste trying to force the potion out to speak to breathe but her movements were already growing sluggish. Her eyes drooping despite her best efforts to be strong and keep them open may the gods spit on you I deserved more I am the queen not like this I deserved more never-ending sleep came quickly blackness sure enough Oberyn was indeed waiting for them near the mountain cell by then he'd grown quite impatient aha at last you arrived the spear wielder declared throwing his arms up at the sight of Naruto. With Arianne in tow he paused at the sight of the scratches marring the prince's cheek what have you two been up to down here no never mind that this full guard of yours won't let me and he waved an angry hand at the nearby soldier frowning deeply the man believes my life will be in danger tell him otherwise the guard in question offered a mute shrug beneath the prince's questioning stare but otherwise remained most firm refusing to budge in spite of the Martell's protest king's orders I'm afraid lord he said no one is to see Gregor Clegane without express permission from the royal family. And why not Oberyn demanded no one else is capable of stopping him when he's awake Qyburn chose that moment to speak I'm afraid he's become a tad resistant to my methods as if to emphasis that very point the door shook causing many to jump he has a fair point Uncle Arianne argued eyeing the dark bulk behind the bars warily a caged beast is often the most dangerous. And you are unarmed then someone give me a sword her uncle replied here Naruto sighed and handed his fellow prince one of his long daggers Arianne blinked where were you hiding that the whiskered prince flashed a small smile dirty jokes are still dirty you know Lambert he barked at the guard let Lord Oberyn and prince's orders I'll go with him myself no one else is to enter Arianne rounded on him what I'm not letting you in there with him Naruto snapped biting back a growl it's too dangerous he is chained she cried you said so yourself a chained beast is the most Dangerous. The princess of Sunspear opened her mouth to refute his claim and snapped it shut. Oh, you're clever. I try now. Open the gate as you wish, your grace. The guard relented, reluctantly reaching back to the ring of keys at his belt and unbarring the door at last. Oberyn all but marched right past the man, stormed into the open cell and threw caution to the wind. Eager to make it to the end of the aisle to where his prey awaited, Naruto followed at a more leisurely pace, wary of the hulking form lurking at the end of the room. Within good reason, he was not so eager to meet death that he would fling himself at it headlong. If that Hulk got his hands on either of them, they would die. He had no illusions of any other outcome. The great Goliath would rip theirs head right off, and there would be no coming back from that. The thought made him nervous, but not enough to risk leaving Oberyn alone with a man-made killer, even if the cell was dark and dank with nearly no light beyond that of a lone flickering torch. But it seemed Gregor Clegane had seen better days. Someone had taken it into their head to have him beaten and flogged. His face and chest were a mess of mangled bruises and pus-filled wounds a length over, yet even then stripped as he was of armor and weapons, and despite, or perhaps in spite of his many wounds, he'd managed to break 2 of the 4 chains holding him with sheer strength alone. It was something to be wary of. Certainly, unsurprisingly, he was quite conscious even in his condition enough to raise his gaze as they approached and offer a hackle-raising snarl. What do you want, bastard? Naruto stiffened slightly. Right now I want to cut your balls off. Oberyn remained unfazed. Do you know who I am? He asked, stepping forward. Another dead man. I am Oberyn Martell. You killed my sister Elia Martell. The prince's voice may have appeared calm to an outside observer, but the very words themselves vibrated with menace, years worth of anger compacted into a single heated moment. You raped her, you murdered her, you killed her children. Confess. He brandished his borrowed dagger in an unspoken threat. Say it now, and we can make this quick. To his surprise, however, the elder Clegane, pushing himself upright up on the back of both knees, chuckling deeply, laughter greeted them like the sound of thunder. You're a fucking idiot. Even crippled as he was, Gregor Clegane was still quick, murderously quick. One was faster. Oh fuck. Yakushina descended with a mournful howl cleaving through flesh and bone like butter. Clegane howled in angry surprise. His attack aborted mid-lunge, fingers falling well short of Oberyn's unprotected head. Naruto cut down again, and that howl warped into a shriek of pain. Gregor's right arm flopped to the stone floor, severed at the elbow, unmoving as its once former owner writhed and clutched at the severed stump in a vain effort to staunch the bleeding. Oberyn blinked, not for the blood spattering his face and clothes, not for the limb on the floor, but out of annoyance, ire that someone had claimed the first strike on what he clearly deemed to be his prize. I had it under control. Hazel eyes gleamed with restrained anger as he turned to face his fellow prince. Why did you do that? Would you rather I let him burst your head like a melon? Naruto hissed, his gaze sliding back to Gregor. What about you, big guy? Anything to say? Fuck you, the son of the Stag snorted. You really want those to be your last words? Come on, you can do better, cunt. Naruto exchanged a wry look with Oberyn and shrugged. Your shit at dying, he drawled darkly. You know that when the mountain merely moaned, he tasted Valyrian steel once again, the razor-sharp edge opening an angry line against his cheek. Confess, or I take the other hand, or I could just let you bleed to death. Oberyn thumbed his chin, considering him a slow one would be best. How do I know you won't just fucking kill me? I am a man of my word, Naruto replied. I swear I won't kill you. Swear it on the old gods and the new. Fine, I did it, the brute growled through clenched teeth, glaring up at them. Elia Martell. I killed her, raped her, murdered her children on Tywin Lannister's orders. By this time he'd become quite pale from loss of blood, his already pallid visage drained a frightening shade of chalk white. Now fucking do something, you shit. Now Naruto stepped back. As you wish. Oberyn was also a man of his word. No sooner had Clegane confessed to his crime than the prince drove the dagger home in the rapist's skull, burying it to the hilt in a fountain of scarlet blood. Gregor Clegane felt only the briefest flash of pain before he perished. He didn't even have time to gasp before his expression went slack, his body left slumping against the chains, dribbling bits of gore and brain matter onto the floor. He died as he had lived, suddenly and sharply, with no care for anyone else beyond himself. For my sister, Oberyn hissed, giving the dagger one final wrench, ripping the weapon free and savaging the corpse one final time. It felt strange, cleansing, at least it should have, but he knew in his heart that he'd not yet avenged her. He'd merely butchered the puppet. Its master was still out there somewhere, plotting, scheming. She wouldn't know peace until he was slain. Naruto observed it all with an air of quiet detachment, letting him have his moment, waiting until he was done. Oberyn found he rather liked him. Oh, he pretended not to care, but he did. You have my thanks for all that you've done. He offered his hand in friendship, and the son of the Stag accepted it straight away. Dorne will fight beside with you when you face your enemies. He gave the corpse one last kick for good measure. And I myself will stand with you. I intend to see Tywin Lannister's head on a pike before I die. I'll hold you to that. Naruto blinked. Then wait, you're staying, won't you be? I don't know. Bored? Of course not. Oberyn laughed. Ilaria and I have our ways. Care to join us? She speaks most fondly of last evening. The assassin choked his Face flushing red. I think I'll pass. Oh, you were not so humble before. One time with the air pinched his nose. Also, I need to ask you for a favor. Gladly. Please don't tell Danny we just did this. Why not? Naruto looked at him as though he were mad. She'll get ideas. Some hours later, when the door swung open, Jaime Lannister was ready to die. Fighting with all of his remaining strength, he lunged upright and flung himself at his jailer, chain in hand. He wasn't expecting to run into a wall of muscle and metal. Months of solitude without training had stripped him of much of his strength, and so when a pair of massive hands seized him by the shoulders, he was all but powerless to resist. His feeble thrashing did not but draw a grunt from his captor, even more so when said hands threw him right back into the cell with a harsh thud. For a fleeting moment he thought he was looking at the mountain. No, this wasn't Greater Clegane, but a man nearly as large, bristling with armor and quiet menace, large hands locked around his hands and feet, returning him to where he was chained against the wall. This time without the slightest of slack. Jaime hissed softly, and the giant tightened them still until it was all he could do to simply bow his head. Calm down, little man. Ulrich Umber rumbled, tightening the chain one final time. Don't make me break you. You've got a visitor. With that said, he swung the door the rest of the way open and stepped aside. Tywin's heir braced himself for the worst. In the end, he needn't have bothered. It wasn't Tyrion, it wasn't the prince, it wasn't even the bloody king. Instead, a young woman with pale hair entered the cell. Violet eyes narrow, an angry or blue leather gown caught the light of the torches and seemed to shimmer in the dim light, casting shadows where there should be none, playing havoc with his eyes. It was only when she stepped into the light that he recognized her. He'd never seen her a day in his life, yet he recognized her at once. All the same, it was there in the way that she held herself, the slight tilt of her head as she regarded him. She didn't even need her dragons, it was those eyes, eerie orbs burning like 1,000 seething vats of wildfire. All the blood in his body turned to ice that melted beneath the blaze of her gaze. Who are you? But he already knew that, didn't he? This was the daughter of the Mad King. I am Daenerys Targaryen, she said, each word spoken with the heat of dragon flame itself. I have a message for you. Gathering himself up with as much confidence as he could find, the Kingslayer propped himself up against the wall and mustered his most fearless smile. You'll forgive me if I don't bow. Daenerys frowned. Aha, and there it was, the insufferable Lannister arrogance she'd heard so much about but never seen for herself until now. Even with the unkempt bear, even in rags and stripped of his gilded golden armor, Kingslayer somehow managed to poison her against his family in a matter of moments. It was that smug sense of superiority one Tyrion utterly lacked. At least the dwarf was somewhat likable. It helped that he was somewhat in awe of her and her dragons, of course, and that he knew who his betters were. Not this one. Even in chains, he still thought he held all the cards. As such, she took great pleasure in trumping that impenetrable confidence, tearing down the wall of his folly. Have you spoken to your sister? Kingslayer, the smile dimmed somewhat. You're the first visitor I've had in months. He raised his manacled arms for emphasis. Not exactly the best place for visitors. What does it matter? At any rate, my sister means nothing to me. The mother of dragons couldn't have asked for a better opportunity to call his bluff. Had he asked her himself, Ser Jorah would not approve of what she was about to do. Of course, he'd counsel mercy and wisdom. He wouldn't approve of this. Oh no, not one bit. Then you'll be pleased to know she's dead. Jaime's smile and spirit shattered as one. It was as if a black hole had opened in the pit of his stomach all at once, swallowing everything. All hope, all emotion, all light, any figment he might have had of escaping vanished in that instant, devoured with everything else. Part of him clung to denial, refusing to even acknowledge the bloody words lest they poison his resolve even further, because to admit it was to destroy himself. Even now he could feel himself crumbling. It took all he had to erect his facade once more, to prevent it from crumbling. What? No, he shook his head. You're lying. My husband killed her hours ago as a wedding gift to me, replied the mother of dragons with a slight smile. I thought you should know how it feels to lose someone. Considering. No, Jaime shook his head, adamant in his defiance. I don't believe that either. You're no queen, you don't have the authority to demand such a thing. My reign has just begun. She permitted herself the smallest of smiles. And the prince killed your lover for me. All the same, all lies on her part, of course. Well, mostly lies. Naruto certainly wasn't her husband, not yet, and she'd only just learned of Cersei's demise by pure happenstance. But Jaime needn't know that she sought only to twist the knife in his heart. She didn't deny it at all. It felt good to watch him falter beneath her stare, to see him crumble and all but fall to pieces as news of his lover's death destroyed him from within. Vengeance was a dish best served cold, after all, and mother of dragons though she might be, Daenerys knew how to be very cold where her enemies were concerned. I don't believe you. So he wished to be stubborn. Then Daenerys turned her head with exaggerated poise. Ser Ulrich the knight reached into the satchel at his hip and removed the bloody parcel. Jaime stiffened, his dirty face torn somewhere between shock and horror. 2 steps later, and the great Goliath laid it to rest at his feet, face up, eyes wide and staring. Surprisingly, he hadn't required much prodding. When it came to beheading a corpse, he'd been downright cheery about it. Such was his hate for the Lannisters. She imagined he too took great joy in this. She could see it in the care with which he arranged the Queen Mother's severed head, just so allowing it to catch the light, confirming her identity beyond all shadow of a doubt. For a fleeting moment all fell silent in the black cells, but only a moment. Then came the shouting, the screaming. The Kingslayer's cry was music to Dany's ears, sweet, sweet music, equal parts rage and despair. She looked on in quiet pleasure as he lunged against his chains, weeping, cursing her and everyone, everything. He swore he would kill her, that he would make her pay for this, how she would suffer, how her children and their children's children would suffer until the end of time. Rather impressive his threats went, but she didn't bat an eye for any of it, and when the Kingslayer realized that didn't faze her, he seemed to give up altogether. Are you finished? 7 hells. What do you want? He moaned, bereft. You didn't come down here just to show me this? When she didn't answer, he hastened on, averting his gaze from the severed head at his feet. I've changed my mind. I'm ready to die. Get it over with now. Daenerys blinked, smiling coldly. Today Jaime felt the fear dig deeper in his heart. He'd expected a dagger in his chest. That didn't happen. What came next was far worse. To his dismay, the last Targaryen leaned forward, her lips just brushing the outer lobe of his right ear. You're not going to die today, Kingslayer, she whispered. You're not going to die for a very long time. Jaime stiffened. No. Oh yes, Dany repeated, savoring each word and the horror it brought to him. You will live as I have lived my entire life, knowing that one day, someday, I will come for you. You will not know the day nor the hour. It will come when you least expect. You will live to see your worst fear realized. King's Landing will return to the Targaryens as it was meant to be. You won't be able to run, nor will you hide. I will find you, and then I will burn you when that time comes. When I decide your fate, you will pray for death. There's no need for that, the Lannister argued. Just kill me and be done with it. Kill me. Daenerys shook her head, deaf to his plea. No, I don't think so. With that she turned and strode away. Kill me. Jaime groaned at her back. Please, your gods have forsaken you, she declared, gripping the latch of the door in hand. I am your god now, and I demand that you suffer. Kill me. The door slammed shut on Jaime's howl, leaving the Kingslayer to stew in his misery. They hit without warning. He never even saw the blade, distracted as he was. One moment he was reading his letters, the next someone thrust a dagger through his right lung. A man sends his regards. Naruto blinked, staring owlishly at the sword protruding from his chest, its edge caked with blood, stabbed in the back. Odd way to go, one he hadn't expected. Well, fuck, that was his last thought before the darkness took him. The dream left him then, and the son of the Stag opened bleary eyes, raw from lack of sleep. Odd, he thought he heard a man scream just now. Impossible, surely it was his imagination, merely part of the nightmare. It probably wasn't. His first realization was that his nap had proved short-lived. The waning light of a blood-red sun across the balcony told him evening was over, and they were now well into the evening. His dreams had been angry and restless again, visions of a future that was but was also yet to be. Bells rang in the September, heralding a wedding. Armies ripped one another apart, fleets burned, dreams of fire and flame, the dead marching on King's Landing. Dreams he didn't know how to stop. How could you stop the dead? Burning them was certainly an option, but how did you stop them? Put them down for good. He suspected a visit to the Wall was in order, and soon before that threat became more than just a threat, but an actual danger. All thoughts of that ceased when he realized he was looking at Daenerys Stormborn. Kill her, the voices snarled. Narrowly he suppressed them. This was either still part of his dream, which it very well might be, considering she was wearing little more than a thin chemise gown, or he was awake somehow. She'd climbed onto his bed when he was asleep, which was rather alarming in and of itself. If his guards let just anyone into his quarters these days, then how the hell was he going to avoid assassins? He'd have to have a word with Ulrich about that. No visitors without his express permission, or there would be a penalty of some sort. Yes, he ought to make that a rule. Ahem, right, Daenerys, is there a reason you're in my bed? He sighed. For a moment he thought she'd snap at him. In all honesty, he expected it. Surprisingly, she didn't. Instead, she shifted slightly, folding her hands in her lap. It was a surprisingly demure position from someone so fierce, a woman so indomitable, so adamantly Targaryen. Alarm bells went off in his head. In the short time in which they'd known one another, she'd never humbled herself before him. Not once ever. That she was doing so now while wearing that was utterly baffling for all the wrong reasons. I wish to speak with you, she said. It's almost night. I'm aware. Crap, he knew that look well. It meant she wasn't going to leave him be unless he used force. The stubborn set of her jaw, the way her eyes caught the setting rays of the sun, burning with determination. He was entirely too tired to push her away, and not being quite awake himself, didn't have the presence of mind to refute her. She wouldn't leave, at any rate not until she'd said her piece. All right, he relented, sitting up, fighting to meet her eyes. What do you want? I wish to propose an alliance. Alliance? The prince found himself blinking. Oh right, riot. I did mention something like that, didn't I? Sleep had well and truly eluded him by now. It was impossible to. He wouldn't be resting his tired eyes anytime soon, not with the mother of dragons in his bed, and certainly not when she was wearing that, grumbling softly to Himself he scrubbed at his face with the back of his knuckles, rubbing away the last vestiges of drowsiness out of his eyes. You and Varys finally had a chat, did you? Her expression was telling. What does this alliance entail exactly? He yawned. Daenerys Targaryen gazed at him for a long agonizing moment, her expression torn somewhere between looming doubt and quiet skepticism. Once again he expected another outburst of pride, or barring that stubborn emotion, at least anger of some sort. As such he was floored when she straightened up, looked him right in the eye, and declared in firm tones, "It entails an offer of marriage." Naruto tumbled off the bed and to the floor, clutching his sides in a vain attempt to hold back the laughter. She actually had a sense of humor, who would have thought? But in the ensuing silence that followed, a seed of silent dread planted itself in his heart. Dany hadn't moved, she hadn't even spoken since he'd all but crashed off the bed. In fact, she was still sitting there, lips pursed, brow dark with clouds of restrained anger. Rather adorable, really. Wait, he poked his head up over the bed. You're serious? Why, I find your presence rather agreeable, the mother of dragons confessed, averting her gaze. You are not the man I thought you were. You're more. And who did you think I was? Naruto inquired, climbing back onto the bed beside her. Do tell. I thought you were a drunkard and a glutton who delighted in whores and wine, she confessed, uncaring when he cringed. A coward, someone who let others do his bidding while you hid behind your guards and let them do the killing for you. I was wrong all the while. Naruto firmly resisted the urge to bang his skull against the headboard. So she knew about his little misadventure in the dungeons. After all, of course she did. Was no one capable of keeping a secret in this blasted city? He wasn't about to ask what else she'd been up to while he slept. She just refused to tell him. I'm not the man you think I am. But you are, Daenerys argued against his irked expression, her voice growing more and more insistent with each passing moment. I see that now. You took what you thought was rightfully yours and let none stand in your way. When your enemies threatened you, fought back until they were either destroyed or too broken to retaliate against you. You weren't some pampered prince, a milk-besotted noble born clutching a silver spoon. You were a bastard. You admitted it to me yourself. You came from nothing, you had nothing, yet you fought and clawed your way into power with fire and blood to get here, to stand where you are now. Nice speech, Naruto snorted, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. Coming from a Targaryen, that's actually kind of flattering. Still haven't explained why you want me to marry you, though. You need a lot more than mutual interests to marry someone, and yet you're to wed Marjorie, she scoffed, shifting closer. Is that no? The prince drew back with a start. That's different. Is it? She challenged with heat in her words, refusing to back down. When I came to King's Landing you could have had me executed on the spot. A hand snaked out, claiming his wrist before he could hope to retreat to safety again, before he could think to escape. You claimed you had no part in that conspiracy to bring me here. By all rights you didn't have to defend me, yet you did. Her eyes held his as she climbed into his lap, and the prince went stiff beneath her. You let yourself be beaten bloody for me, she said, stroking his face. A stranger and outcast, a threat to your reign. Naruto opened his mouth to refute such a thing. To be fair, as a result the kiss caught him entirely flat-footed. Daenerys merely brushed her mouth against his, yet it was enough to silence him all the same. She paused, lingered, breath warm on his face. You angered your father, the king, merely by speaking in my defense. The words were softer now, nearly a whisper, as though she were admitting it as much to herself as she was him. You kept me safe, you protected me when I did. While you two did not ask for it at first, I didn't understand that. Why would you do such a thing? What did you have to gain? I wondered. I expected you to make demands of me, to take my dragons as payment, but you asked for nothing. You treated me as an equal when no else would. I think I know why now. Do enlighten me. You're a good person, Naruto. I'm really not. He shook his head. He wasn't, not at all. He could be cruel and mean and flawed. How did a handful of good deeds make up for all the violent acts he'd committed along the way? He'd killed, and as much as he deemed it necessary to silence the voices, there was still that small part of him that enjoyed it. That someone so jaded could think of him as anything more was humbling painfully. So she kissed him again, harder this time, distracting him. You are no I. Seven hells. Naruto tried to disagree, but the words peeked into a groan. His hands had long since betrayed him, reaching up to peel the gown away from Daenerys Stormborn when he wasn't looking. Her hands were already at work on his trousers, stripping it, and that last vestige of self-control away. Look, let's say I agree to this, he managed, struggling to distract himself from the fantastic things she was doing to him with her hips. It won't end well. I'm really not the marrying sort. He winced at the thought, and the pain it invoked. I've screwed up too many times. I'm broken. I don't think I even know how to love anymore. You'll be miserable with me. You'll be competing with Marjorie every day for the rest of your life. I won't make you happy. I don't think I can. I think you will. When lips pressed against his again, they were warmer than any dragon. Meanwhile in the Riverlands, Eleanor sneezed mightily, expelling a thin cloud of hot steam into the frigid afternoon air. The sound caused Ramsay's hounds to start, but she ruthlessly ignored them, determinedly digging deeper into her fur cloak. The dog's incessant braying didn't help either. This weather seemed to worsen more and more with each Passing day now, and at times she could barely feel her fingers, much less her toes. Damn, the north, she was used to a far warmer climate. Not you've been doing that a lot lately, Ramsay remarked. Caught a cold, the shield maiden bit back a groan. It would all be over soon. They'd finally found her trail. Arya Stark had been right under their noses the entire time. Once they realized she was with the Hound, it was a simple matter of following the bodies. It began with 3 dead men and an inn, and from there went on a merry chase through the Riverlands, following the trail of the dead Stark Lannister. Even a few phrased their banners always varied, but each had one thing in common: not a one of those bodies had any coin or food on them. Whomever killed them took great pains to fleece them of any and all valuables, which was rather suspicious in and of itself. The Hound wasn't subtle when it came to combat. Anyone fool enough to cross him found themselves dead in a ditch, or worse, no, someone was with him, and that someone made sure every body was picked clean. Of course, that could only mean down. Eleanor's only warning came in the form of an startled cry from Ramsay. Then a large dark shape lunged from a nearby hill and crashed into her mount with all the force of a rolling avalanche. The horse reared, throwing her from the saddle with an angry neigh. Oddly enough, this saved her life. Instead of having her head split open, the sword sheared an angry red line across her scalp as she rolled aside. Painful perhaps, but not lethal. Amidst the chaos she heard the hounds baying. Their cries ended in a sharp, ugly squeal as their attacker dispatched them. Tumbling to her feet, she spied Ramsay desperately parrying their attacker's blows, bleeding from an ugly wound in his right arm. She barely had time to see said attacker before he lunged forward and impaled the poor Bolton on his blade, skewering him through the stomach as though he were a pig at a nine-day feast. All Ramsay managed was a broken gurgle before his attacker tore him free, sending his body sprawling to the dirt in a messy heap of blood and entrails. Then he turned on Eleanor. In doing so he presented an ugly burned visage more known to her than the face of death itself. Shit, Sandor Clegane was a monster of a swordsman, and he was fast, far faster than she'd give him credit. Before he lunged at her, before she could hope to speak, his great sword arcing down at her head, merely blocking, numbed her hand behind the shield and threatened to send it clattering from her fingers altogether. Somehow Eleanor held on, weathering blow after blow behind the bulwark. Then she beat him bloody with it in the time that it took Clegane to raise his sword again. The nimble shield maiden darted under his guard and swiped up at him, with her sharpened shield bloodying the larger man's nose. Against a man like the Hound, it didn't so much stop him as it did stun him, but it did buy her the time to throw a vicious right hook into his face, hurl him to the ground, and bring her sword up again. Cold steel found his throat an instant later. Yield, she snarled. Beaten by a woman, the Hound groaned. They'll never let me live this down. Where's Arya Stark? The Hound spat. Fuck off. A blade poked against the small of her back. Stop craning her head. Eleanor spotted a young girl not a stone's throw away, watching her keenly. In her hand she clutched a thin sword that more resembled a rapier than an actual blade. Said girl also looked all of a mere moment from skewering her through with said sword. Eleanor daren't turn. She couldn't risk leaving her back open to someone like the Hound, but in the same vein she couldn't leave her back open to the girl either. It really was a nasty little weapon. Wait, a spark of recognition sparked to life inside her. Robb had mentioned such a sword. You're Arya Stark. The girl with boyish hair started, then hastily covered her surprise with a scowl. No, I'm not. Who are you? Yup. Definitely Arya, your brother sent me to bring you home. The shield maiden spoke slowly, keenly aware of the blade mere inches from ending her life. He's been searching for you, you know, Robb. Aha, there's a war on, remember? Clegane growled. Don't believe her. OOF. A boot on his chest. Shut him up right quick. Not anymore, Eleanor argued, pressing down. Look, I'm going to reach into my sack. Hell, now I'd appreciate it if you didn't skewer me like a pig. The Lord of Winterfell had indeed given them a message for this very purpose. So had Naruto. Against her better judgment she straightened, and wincing at the pain in her back, sheathed her blade. The tip of needle vanished. Not a heartbeat later the red wine heaved a sigh of relief and dipped a hand into her pack, retrieving the parchment from within. That's my father's seal. Arya blinked, solemnly accepting the scroll. Your brother's now. Ned Stark's daughter didn't answer that, instead breaking the wax seal and quietly opening the message. She stood that way for what felt like a small eternity, eyes greedily devouring the words within. The entire time Eleanor dared not take her boot from Sandor's chest, not until the Stark girl finished reading. Her eyes were decidedly misty. After I believe you. Thank you. Wincing she removed her heel and allowed the Hound to climb to his feet. I'm not here to hurt you, Clegane. Yeah, that boy of yours tried. You saw what happened to him. I don't care about Ramsay Bolton. He wasn't part of my mission. Scoffing, she handed him another scroll meant for his eyes alone. Sandor scowled, confused. The fuck is this? A royal proclamation by the prince? Eleanor answered, her eyes never once leaving his, watching for any impossible sign of undue movement. Any and all crimes you've committed under the Lannisters are forgiven. You can go home. And so could she. The thought thrilled her, but she schooled her face into impassivity. What do you say? I'm not a knight. My brother's a knight. Fuck that. He shook his head, his perpetual scowl deepening even Further, I'm not wearing that fucking white cloak again. He's not asking you to be a part of the Kingsguard. He's got a better offer for you. What kind of offer? The kind you can't refuse. For a split second she actually thought he might attack. After a moment the hound grunted, got any chicken? Eleanor brightened. Indeed I do.